The wind did not howl. It screamed. It tore through the jagged, ice-choked peaks of the Bitterroot, ranged like a starving beast, ripping at the shredded hem of the mud-caked woolen dress that offered no warmth. Elara fell. Her knees, bruised and trembling from days of aimless, terrified wandering, finally gave out. The snow was a blinding, suffocating white, packing into her thin leather boots. Her lungs burned kept hot every shallow, ragged breath. Her vision narrowed to a single, blurry pinpoint of yellow light in the vast, freezing darkness. A window, a cabin. She dragged herself forward. The jagged ice beneath the powder scraped her raw, delicate hands, tearing the last protective layers of skin, but the crushing weight of her fear and grief drove her inches closer. A massive, heavy timber door loomed ahead out of the whiteout. She raised one numb, frost-bitten fist, struck the rough-hewn wood with the hollow sound of a dying sparrow hitting a pane of glass, and collapsed. The blackness finally took her. There is a kind of cold that freezes a person from the inside out, the kind of cold that comes not just from the wind, but from a profound, lonely grief. Have you ever known someone so impossibly fragile, a starving, delicate widow forced to face the absolute harshness of the world, entirely alone? If you appreciate stories where a giant, silent protector swears to shield the broken, please take a moment to like this tale, subscribe to our fireside, and share your thoughts in the comments about the topic of finding unexpected sanctuary. Your company keeps these stories burning bright. Now, let us look to the other side of that heavy timber door. Inside the cabin, the heavy thud barely registered above the roaring tempest. Silas Vance stood by the hearth, a rusted iron poker gripped in his massive hand. He paused, his head tilting toward the entrance. A man who lived high above the tree line, utterly alone in a fortified cabin, knew every natural creak of the seasoned timber, every whistle of the mountain downdraft. That sound was wrong. It was too soft to be a snapping branch, too deliberate to be a falling rock. He set the iron aside. Silas was a towering mountain of a man, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall. His shoulders seemed to span the width of the roaring hearth, his body built of dense, quiet power born from years of isolated, punishing labor. He moved to the heavy oak door with silent, predatory grace, unlatched the thick iron crossbar, and pulled the timber inward. The blizzard rushed in, violently biting at his rugged, wind-hardened face and untamed dark beard. He narrowed his piercing blue eyes against the blinding whiteout. There, crumpled at the toes of his heavy work boots, lay a shape rapidly disappearing beneath the freshly drifted snow. Silas crouched, sweeping a massive hand through the powder. His thick fingers brushed against coarse, freezing wool, and then, impossibly, a strand of dull, wet wheat-gold hair. He froze, a deep, heavy frown carved lines into his weathered forehead. He hooked his hands under the frozen bundle and lifted. The weight of her shocked him. She weighed almost nothing. She was a collection of hollow bones, starved frame, and sheer, stubborn willpower wrapped in a ruined dress. Silas carried her inside, kicking the heavy door, shut kept hot his boot, and dropping the iron bar back into place. The sudden silencing of the wind was deafening. The immediate, enveloping heat of the cabin washed over them, carrying the thick, comforting scent of burning pine, cured leather, and hot wood smoke. He carried her toward the back of the single-room cabin, stopping beside his own bed, a sturdy frame built of heavy logs, piled high with thick, cured bear furs and woolen blankets. He laid her down gently. As the firelight caught her face, Silas felt a strange, tight knot form in his broad chest. She was strikingly beautiful, but harrowing to look upon. Her skin was as ghostly, translucent pale, tightly stretched over her delicate cheekbones from weeks of severe starvation. Her lips were tinted a dangerous, icy blue. He had to act, and he had to act with absolute precision. His hands, massive and heavily calloused from felling timber and breaking ice, flexed instinctively, a quiet, recurring habit he displayed whenever confronted with something delicate that he feared his immense strength might break. He began the careful, agonizingly slow process of saving her life. He untied the thin, threadbare shawl that was frozen solid to her shoulders, peeling it away and tossing it onto the floorboards. He unlaced her ruined boots, pulling them off to reveal soaked stockings and toes white with frost. He did not undress her further, honoring a silent boundary of respect, but he piled 3 heavy, dry blankets over her shivering form. The cabin was a physical fortress against the mountain's fury, built with impenetrable log walls and chinked with deep mud. Nothing could hurt her in here. Yet, looking down at her, Silas felt a profound sense of helplessness. A meaningful reflection washed over his stoic mind. He had spent years up here, running from the ghosts of his past, building a wall between himself and the rest of humanity, because he believed his presence only brought ruin. But looking at this shattered, impossibly small woman, who had literally fallen onto his doorstep, he wondered what profound cruelty the world below had inflicted to drive a creature so fragile up into the deadly high country. She did not belong here. She was a delicate flower, dropped into a grinding avalanche. He pulled a heavy wooden chair beside the bed and sat, the wood groaning under his immense weight. He reached under the blankets and found her icy, trembling hands. They were raw, the cuticles torn, the skin cracked and bleeding. He enveloped her small hands completely within his 2 massive palms, rubbing them with a slow, steady friction, willing his own surging body heat into her frozen veins. The warmth in the cabin deepened. The thick furs over her chest began to rise and fall with slightly more rhythm. Silas heated a small iron cup of water over the coals. Returning to her side, he dipped a clean, soft linen cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and leaned over her. With the gentle precision of a man diffusing a trap, he wiped the caked mud and freezing slush from her ghostly pale cheeks. The warmth of the cloth left a faint, rosy trail across her skin. For hours, the storm raged outside, rattling the thick window panes, but inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic sound of Silas' deep breathing. He did not leave her side. He watched her chest. He felt for the pulse at her delicate wrist, his thumb gently pressing against the fragile blue vein. Her body began to violently shake as the hypothermia fought the ambient heat of the room. It was a terrifying, uncontrollable shivering that threatened to tear her exhausted muscles apart. Silas added another heavy skin over her, pressing his large hand firmly against her shoulder to offer grounding weight, to let her deeply unconscious mind know she was tethered to something solid. Then, just past midnight, the violent shivering abruptly stopped. Silas leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes instantly sharp, his jaw clenching hard beneath his beard. A sudden, terrifying stillness overtook her fragile body. The rise and fall of the thick furs seemed to vanish. The silence in the cabin grew oppressive, heavier than the snow piling on the roof. He pressed 2 thick fingers to the side of her delicate neck, holding his own breath, searching for a rhythm in the quiet dark. A faint, rapid flutter beat against the calloused pads of his thick fingers. It was barely there, akin to the frantic wings of a trapped moth, but it was a rhythm. She was not dead. The terrifying stillness had merely been the quiet gathering of a storm inside her own blood. A sudden violent fever broke the icy grip of the hypothermia. Elara was cast violently into the agonizing furnace of a nightmare. The blinding, suffocating white of the snow melted into the oppressive, suffocating darkness of a sprawling, cold manor. Harsh, demanding voices echoed in her mind, tearing at her fragile peace. Cold, unforgiving hands were grabbing her bruised arms, dragging her back toward a life where she was nothing more than property, a cursed ledger entry to be managed and controlled. The weight of their accusations pressed down on her chest, crushing the breath from her lungs. She tried to scream, but throat was filled with hot ice and ashes. She snapped awake. Her lungs hitched, drawing in a sharp, ragged gasp of hot, pine-scented air. Her large, expressive gray eyes flew wide open, adjusting to the dim, flickering orange light. For a fractured second, the absolute warmth of the heavy furs and the smell of wood smoke confused her. This was not the freezing mountainside. But it was not the cold stone of the manor, either. Then, the shadow shifted. A figure loomed beside the bed. Elara's breath caught in her raw throat. The man was a giant. In the dancing firelight, his immense, broad-shouldered silhouette seemed to consume the entire cabin. A thick, untamed beard framed a rugged face, and piercing, intense blue eyes stared down at her from an impossible height. He was massive, built of raw, formidable power. Blind terror seized her shattered nervous system. She scrambled backward. Her delicate, torn hands clawed frantically at the heavy bear furs, tangling in the wool. She pushed herself away from him with sudden, desperate violence, her back slamming hard against the solid timber wall of the cabin. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, making herself as small as humanly possible, her entire delicate frame shaking violently. The terror radiating from her was palpable, thick, and suffocating in the small room. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, bracing her frail body for the inevitable strike. Silas froze. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. His massive, heavily calloused hands flexed instinctively at his sides, a quiet, recurring release of tension, a physical reminder to completely restrain his own overwhelming strength. He had seen that exact look before in the wild. It was the absolute, blinding panic of a cornered animal that had endured too many traps, too many cruelties, and had no fight left to give. It broke something fundamental inside his broad chest. He slowly sank to his knees beside the bed. The heavy wooden floorboards creaked under his weight. But the deliberate lowering of his massive frame removed the towering threat of his height. Peace, the single word rumbled out of him. It was a deep, gravelly vibration. Quiet and steady. Meant to soothe rather than command. Elara flinched at the sound of his voice, keeping her face buried against her bruised knees. Her breath came in rapid, shallow stutters. She waited for the harsh command. She waited for the heavy hand to grab her shoulder and drag her back into the light. She waited for the anger that her existence always seemed to provoke in men. Nothing happened. Seconds stretched into an agonizing, silent minute. The only sound in the cabin was the pop of the sap in the hearth, and the muffled, howling wind outside the thick mud-chinked walls. Hesitantly, terrified of what she might find, Elara cracked her eyes open. The giant had not moved closer. He remained kneeling on the floor, keeping a careful, respectful distance. His large hands were open and resting flat on his own thighs, entirely visible to her. The fierce, piercing blue of his eyes held no anger, no impatience, no cruel intent. They held only a deep, sorrowful quiet. Silas slowly reached toward a small stool beside the bed. Elara tensed, her shoulders hiking up to her ears, but he only retrieved a carved wooden bowl. Steam gently curled from the rim, carrying the rich, savory aroma of roasted marrow, wild root, and healing herbs. He lifted a wooden spoon, scooped a small amount of the clear broth, and held it steady. "Drink," he murmured, his tone as soft as the falling snow. "You are safe." Elara stared at the spoon, her stomach hollowed out, screaming in a painful, twisting agony of starvation. The smell of the broth was a vivid sensory explosion, incredibly intoxicating, pulling at her deepest survival instincts. Yet, the fear of accepting anything from a massive, powerful stranger kept her paralyzed against the wall. Silas read the agonizing war behind her large, grief-stricken gray eyes. He understood. He slowly lowered the spoon back into the bowl. Then, with deliberate, slow movements, he pushed the wooden bowl across the heavy quilt until it rested near her trembling boots. He stood up, backing away slowly, creating a vast expanse of physical distance between them. He retreated entirely across the room, sitting heavily in a large wooden chair near the roaring stone hearth, turning his body slightly away from her to grant her the emotional sanctuary of privacy. The physical warmth of the cabin wrapped around Elara like a protective shield, the heat radiating from the hearth, the heavy, comforting weight of the animal furs against her chilled legs, and the quiet, undemanding presence of the man across the room created a profound, confusing dissonance in her mind. This man possessed the physical power to break her in half. Yet he was purposefully making himself small, deliberately surrendering his dominance to give her space. It was an emotionally memorable moment that fractured the rigid armor of her terror. No man had ever offered her space. No man had ever pulled back his strength out of consideration for her fear. Her trembling, raw fingers crept out from beneath the shawl. She grasped the edges of the carved wooden bowl. The heat of the wood seeped into her frostbitten palms. A searing, beautiful relief. She lifted the rim to her cracked, icy lips. The rich, savory warmth of the broth coated her aching throat, unwinding the tight, frozen knots of her stomach, and sending a sluggish but undeniable river of life back through her exhausted veins. She drank it greedily, unable to stop, tears of absolute physical relief spilling hot and fast down her ghostly pale cheeks. The broth was survival. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark abyss she had been drowning in for weeks. Across the room, Silas watched her through the flickering shadows of the firelight. A profound, meaningful, emotional reflection anchored him to the heavy chair. He had spent his life reading the wilderness, tracking the subtle signs of nature, understanding the unspoken language of the mountains. The woman, shivering in his bed, was speaking a language of pure trauma. The way she had cowered against the timber. The way she had expected a blow simply for waking up. The sheer, blinding terror in her expressive gray eyes when she looked at his hands. She was not just fleeing the brutal winter storms of the Bitterroot Range. The wilderness was dangerous, but it was honest in its brutality. The kind of fear she carried, the flinching, the desperate, shrinking away, was forged only by the deliberate cruelty of human hands. She lowered the empty bowl, her breathing finally slowing to a more natural rhythm, though she Kaipete herself, tightly curled against the far wall, watching him with wary, hyper-vigilant eyes. She was a delicate, broken bird trapped in a cage of her own memories, expecting the giant across the room to eventually reveal his true, cruel nature. Silas rested his elbows on his knees, staring into the dancing flames. He had sworn an oath hot to himself years ago to never let harm come to anyone under his roof again. He would protect this shattered widow from the wind, the ice, and the starvation. But as he listened to her quiet, fearful breaths from the shadows of the bed, a heavier, darker question settled over his solitary world. The mountain had almost killed her, but what manner of monster had she been running from in the world below to make freezing to death seem like a better alternative? The empty wooden bowl trembled in Elara's raw, blistered hands. She held it against her chest as a makeshift shield, her large gray eyes tracking the giant across the room. The wind continued its relentless assault against the thick timber walls, rattling the heavy iron latches, a chaotic symphony of winter fury that made the suffocating silence inside the cabin feel even more profound. Silas remained seated by the hearth, his massive frame perfectly still, granting her the time her shattered nerves desperately required. When he finally moved, it was with the slow, deliberate telegraphing of a draft horse in a confined space. He stood, retrieved a dry log from the iron rack, and fed the fire. Then he crossed the room to a heavy, iron-banded cedar chest, tucked beneath the frosted window. He lifted the lid, the old hinges releasing a quiet groan. Half from within, he withdrew a thick, faded blue flannel shirt and a pair of heavy woolen socks. He carried them to the foot of the bed, laying them gently over the edge of the quilt. He did not look at her. He simply turned his broad, impenetrable back, stepping into the far corner of the cabin to violently busy himself with sharpening a hunting knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic, somber, metallic rasp filled the space, deliberately loud, purposefully distracting. It was an unspoken offering. A quiet, ironclad promise of privacy. Elara stared at the faded blue fabric. The woolen dress clinging to her frail frame was practically fused to her skin, with freezing mud and melted snow, pulling the newly acquired heat from her exhausted bones. With agonizing slowness, her trembling, bruised fingers worked the ruined laces of her bodice. She shed the filthy, heavy wool, letting it fall in a miserable heap onto the floorboards, and pulled the giant S-flannel over her head. The sensory relief was absolute. The shirt was massive, swallowing her delicate frame whole, the hem dropping well past her bruised knees. It was incredibly soft from years of washing, carrying the deep, comforting scent of dried cedar, wood smoke, and clean mountain air. For the first time in weeks, the biting, agonizing sting of the frost began to recede from her skin. The heavy flannel felt like armor. She pulled the thick woolen socks over her raw, icy feet, then pulled her knees back to her chest, burying her face into the oversized collar of the shirt. A meaningful emotional reflection washed through her aching chest. She was warm. She was dry. The man across the room possessed the strength to tear the cabin down with his bare hands. Yet his every action had been carefully calculated to make her feel secure. She had spent a month freezing, hiding in wet ditches and freezing haylofts, expecting the worst from every human shadow. The profound, unearned kindness of this terrifying stranger shattered the final dam holding back her grief. A quiet, broken sob tore through her throat. The rhythmic rasping of the whetstone abruptly ceased. Elara covered her mouth with keepsake hat both hands, terrified of the noise she had made. Squeezing her eyes shut, she waited for the sharp reprimand, the harsh command to quiet down. In the manor, tears were considered a manipulation, an annoyance to be swiftly punished with isolation. The storm will break by morning. His deep, gravelly voice rolled across the room, wrapping around her panic like a heavy blanket. It carried no judgment. It held no impatience. Elara lowered her raw hands, her breath hitching in her chest. Silas was still facing the wall, his broad back an immovable shield between her and the raging blizzard outside. They took everything. Her voice was a ruined, ragged whisper, scraping painfully against her throat. The words spilled out before her terrified mind could stop them. She needed him to know. She needed this giant to understand she was not a thief, not a vagrant, but a woman entirely out of options. If he thought she was a criminal, he might cast her back into the blinding whiteout. Silas remained perfectly still, the hunting knife resting flat against the leather strap. He offered no interruption, holding the space in complete silence. "My Thomas," Elara swallowed hard, the name tasting like ash and lost sunshine. He passed from the summer fever. It was quick. Too quick. Before the earth was even settled over him, they arrived. Her delicate hands tangled violently in the thick fabric of the blue flannel, her knuckles turning white. His family. The Quinns. They owned Ben, the valley, the mills, the magistrates. A bitter, trembling breath shook her frail shoulders. They claimed Thomas died in ruin, that his ledgers were empty. They seized our home. They locked me in the guest quarters like a trespasser in my own life. Across the room, Silas's massive hands flexed instinctively, his thick fingers curling inward until the knuckles cracked in the quiet room. He understood the cruelty of the world, but the specific, calculated cruelty inflicted upon the helpless ignited a deep, dark furnace within his chest. He forced his hands to relax, keeping his posture rigidly calm. Moat was not a wife to them, Elara whispered, the memory painting a hollow, terrifying mask of despair over her beautiful features. Moat was an asset, a ledger entry meant to balance the books. They intended to give me to a man twice my age, a magistrate who held their debts as payment, an indenture of flesh. She looked down at her battered, raw hands. The hands of a gentlewoman forced to tear her way through miles of jagged ice and freezing mud. Mott ran, in the night. Mott took nothing but the clothes I wore, hoping they would think me dead in the river. Her gray eyes, wide and swimming with unshed tears, finally lifted to stare at his broad back. If they find me, if they know but draw breath, they will drag me back in chains. Motum property to them. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the timber roof with the weight of her devastating truth. She braced herself, fully expecting him to recoil from the trouble she had brought to his doorstep. Silas slowly turned around. The firelight caught the harsh, rugged angles of his wind-hardened face. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the frail, trembling sparrow drowning in his oversized shirt, surrounded by the heavy bear furs. He did not look at her with pity. Pity was cheap. Pity stripped a person of their strength. He looked at Moat Fahar with a quiet, burning respect. "You crossed the devil's staircase," Silas rumbled, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "On foot. In a white out. With nothing but a shredded dress." Elara blinked, confused by the sudden shift. Moat had nowhere else. Grown men, hardened trappers, freeze to death in that pass with a full pack and a string of mules, Silas stated, his voice a steady, grounding drumbeat. He took one slow step toward the center of the room. "You survived it." He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her sink back into the shame her in-laws had chained her to. "A ledger cannot bleed," Silas murmured, his tone carrying a profound, immovable finality. "A ledger cannot climb a mountain. You are breathing. That makes you flesh, not coin. You are not property here." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A warmth beat deeply in her chest, entirely separate from the heat of the fire. "You are not property here." The quiet dignity in his assertion, the sheer undeniable fact of his belief in her humanity, fractured the icy shell of her grief. For the first time since Thomas died, Elara lowered her bruised knees. She let her spine relax against the heavy wooden headboard, her body melting into the furs, emotionally exhausted but feeling the first, terrifying spark of true safety. Silas watched the tension drain from her delicate frame. He gave a single, slow nod, turning his attention back to the frosted window panes. The fragile thread of trust had been cast between them. But as Silas stared into the blinding white void beyond the glass, the dark furnace in his chest continued to burn. He knew the nature of men who viewed the world in ledgers and debts. Wealthy men did not simply let their investments keep a loca away into the dark. They possessed resources. They held influence. The bitter winter storm would bury her tracks for now, burying her scent under 10 feet of impenetrable powder. But the mountain could not stay frozen forever. Spring would eventually thaw the passes, and when the ice finally broke, the men with badges, bloodhounds, and a mandate to collect their property would come looking. Silas gripped the heavy timber of the windowsill, his jaw clenched tight beneath his thick beard. When the wrath of the valley finally met the immovable wall of the high country, how much blood would he have to spill to keep her safe? The storm blew itself out by the third day, leaving in its wake a world entombed in blinding, glittering ice. The heavy snowdrifts reached the lower window panes of the cabin, locking them inside a silent, frozen fortress. There is a profound grace in the quiet routines of survival. When the world outside is a deadly, impassable expanse of white, the smallest acts of shared existence become the very foundation of life. Silence, when wielded by cruel men, is a weapon used to starve a soul. But silence in the hands of a protector is a thick, woven blanket, offering absolute emotional safety. A natural, unspoken rhythm developed between the giant and the delicate specter haunting his cabin. Silas awoke hours before the sun breached the jagged peaks. He moved with a ghostly quietness that completely defied his massive size. He would stoke the dying embers, haul fresh timber from the indoor stack, and melt a basin of snow. Every morning, Elara would wake from the heavy, dreamless sleep of exhaustion to the comforting crackle of a roaring fire. She would find a heavy woolen blanket tucked a little higher around her frail shoulders. On the small wooden stool beside the bed, a tin cup of pine needle tea always sat waiting, perfectly steeped, a wisp of fragrant aromatic steam curling into the chilly morning air. Silas never hovered to watch her drink it. He simply left the warmth behind for her to find. Her physical strength returned in agonizingly slow, microscopic increments. The ghostly pallor of starvation still clung to her cheeks, and her wrists remained heartbreakingly thin, but the violent trembling had ceased. She spent the first few days cocooned in his oversized blue flannel shirt, safely tucked beneath the bare furs, watching the towering hermit work. She observed him with a growing, quiet admiration. Silas was a force of nature, yet his power was always perfectly contained. He would sit by the hearth, using a heavy iron drawknife to shave down a piece of cured hickory. His massive arms worked the blade with terrifying ease, curling thick ribbons of wood onto the floorboards. Yet his touch upon the wood was remarkably patient. He never rushed. He never slammed doors. He existed in a state of deliberate, grounded calm. For Elara, whose entire life had been dictated by the loud, demanding expectations of the Quinn family, this complete absence of pressure was intoxicating. Her in-laws had hammered a cruel lesson into her spirit. A woman who did not produce, who did not serve, was a useless parasite unworthy of shelter. The lingering ghosts of that cruelty made her deeply restless. She desperately needed to earn her keep. She refused to be a burden to the man who had pulled her from the ice. On the 5th day, while Silas was outside clearing the heavy drifts from the woodshed, Elara pushed herself out of the bed. Her legs wobbled, weak as a newborn fawn's, but she forced her bruised feet to carry her across the heavy timber floorboards. The cabin was a symphony of vivid sensory details. The air was permanently infused with the sharp, clean bite of mountain ozone, layered beneath the rich, intoxicating smells of roasting root vegetables, cured leather, and hot wood smoke. Elara moved to the washstand. She found Silas's heavy work shirts and thick woolen socks stacked haphazardly from his morning chores. Her raw, healing fingers gently gathered the massive garments. She carefully folded the thick flannels, smoothing the coarse fabric they kept a tender, rhythmic reverence. The shirts dwarfed her delicate hands, holding the deep, comforting scent of cedar and pine that belonged entirely to him. It was a minuscule contribution, practically nothing against the monumental effort he exerted to keep them both alive. But the simple act of restoring order to his belongings filled her with a desperate sense of purpose. The heavy timber door suddenly creaked open, admitting a furious swirl of biting, icy air. Silas stepped inside, kicking the snow from his heavy leather boots. He paused, his broad shoulders filling the entryway. His piercing blue eyes immediately swept the room, checking the bed first. Finding it empty, his gaze tracked to the washstand. Elara froze. A heavy, dark gray shirt clutched to her chest. Her large, expressive gray eyes widened in sudden apprehension. She braced herself for a reprimand, fearing he would view her touching his things as an intrusion, a violation of his solitary space. Silas looked at the neat, meticulous stack of folded clothes. He looked at her frail, trembling form. He did not speak a word of correction. Instead, the harsh, wind-bitten lines of his face softened. He offered a single, slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging her effort without demanding a single ounce more from her. He quietly closed the door, sealing the bitter cold outside once again. The tension drained from her spine, replaced by a profound, blooming warmth. Later that evening, Elara attempted to push her boundaries further. The iron cooking crane swung over the open flames of the hearth, holding a massive, cast iron kettle filled with hot boiling water and wild tubers. She wanted to serve the meal. She wanted to show him she was not made of glass. She stepped to the hearth, wrapping a thick cloth around the iron handle. She gripped it with both hands and pulled. The sheer, monumental weight of the iron immediately defeated her ruined muscles. Her wrists buckled. The kettle violently slipped, tilting sideways, threatening to send a scalding torrent of boiling water cascading over her bare, bruised legs. A massive, calloused hand shot out from the shadows. Silas caught the heavy iron handle, mere inches from disaster. His immense grip locked around the metal, instantly arresting the fall. The sudden display of raw, explosive speed and power was terrifying, but his grip was rock steady. He absorbed the entire weight of the kettle effortlessly, preventing even a single drop of the boiling water from spilling. Elara gasped, stumbling backward, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. She had almost ruined their meal. She had almost severely burned herself, creating an even greater burden for him to bear. Silas did not yell. He did not sigh in frustration. He carefully swung the iron crane back into place over the fire. He stepped back, deliberately flexing his massive, thick fingers, a quiet, recurring physical reminder to restrain his overwhelming strength around her fragile presence. He looked down at her, his striking blue eyes anchoring her spiraling panic. He gently took the thick cloth from her trembling fingers. He scooped a hearty portion of the hot stew into a wooden bowl, carried it to the small table, and pulled out a chair. He looked back at her, gesturing toward the seat with a quiet, grounding tilt of his head. He had caught her weakness, but he had entirely protected her dignity. That night, as Elara slept peacefully beneath the heavy bear furs, Silas remained seated by the dying fire. He needed to find materials to fashion her a proper set of winter clothes. His oversized flannels would not protect her if they ever needed to abandon the cabin. He retrieved her ruined, mud-caked woolen dress from the corner. It was practically shredded, ruined by the ice and jagged rocks of the Devil's staircase. He spread the filthy fabric across his knees, using a stiff brush to clear away the dried mud, hoping to salvage enough workable wool to sew her a thick shawl. As his thick fingers worked along the torn lining of the bodice, he felt a strange, rigid resistance. There was a heavy, unnatural lump sewn deep into the interior pocket of the dress, positioned exactly where it would have rested tightly against Elara's heart. Silas frowned, the deep lines returning to his forehead. He slipped his hunting knife from his belt. With meticulous, surgical care, he severed the ruined threads holding the hidden pocket closed. He reached inside. His massive fingers closed around something impossibly small and painfully soft. He pulled it out into the flickering orange light of the hearth. It was a tiny, hand-knit baby booty. The faded yellow yarn was intricately woven, but the work was violently interrupted. A single, thin wooden knitting needle was still precariously pierced through the unfinished hem, exactly as it had been left when her world had abruptly ended. The yellow wool was deeply stiffened with dried, dark stains that Silas immediately recognized as old, heart-wrenching tears. Silas stared at the tiny object resting in the center of his massive, calloused palm. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly thin. The story she had told him about her husband passing from the summer fever was true, but it was not the complete truth. The Quinn family had not just taken her home. They had not just threatened her with an indenture of flesh. The agonizing, suffocating grief that had nearly driven this delicate woman to a freezing death in the mountains ran far deeper than a widow mourning a lost marriage. His piercing blue eyes lifted from the tiny yellow booty to gaze across the dimly lit room. He watched the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of Elara breathing beneath the heavy furs. The stakes of her survival had just drastically shifted. What absolute, crushing tragedy was she hiding behind those haunted gray eyes? And how long could he truly protect her from a past that refused to stay buried? Silas did not pull the delicate yellow yarn from the ruined seam. He did not leave the unfinished baby booty exposed on the heavy wooden table to demand an explanation in the morning. Instead, moving with the quiet, painstaking precision of a man handling a live ember, he tucked the tiny woven memory back into the hidden pocket. He threaded a bone needle with thick waxed twine and carefully stitched the ruined fabric closed, sealing her devastating secret safely within the wool. He folded the dress, placing it gently at the foot of the bed where she slept. True protection, he knew, was not merely shielding a fragile body from the freezing wind. It was shielding a shattered mind from the excruciating burden of having to justify its own grief. He would wait. When she was ready to speak of the ghost she carried against her heart, he would listen. Until then, the silence would remain her sanctuary. The fire burned down to a deep smoldering bed of crimson coals, casting long, wavering shadows across the heavy timber walls. Silas spread a thick canvas tarp and a heavy elk hide across the floorboards near the hearth, his massive frame seeking rest. The cabin sank into the profound, heavy stillness of the high mountain night. Outside, the blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a world buried in suffocating, absolute quiet. Hours passed. The ambient warmth of the cabin settled. Then, the silence shattered. A low, guttural noise scraped through the darkness. It was a sound born not of physical pain, but of pure, suffocating terror. Elara bolted upright in the bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, entirely frantic, her breath instantly shallow. She clutched the heavy bare furs to her chin, her large expressive gray eyes wide and scanning the dim amber-lit room. The sound came again. A strangled, desperate gasp for air. It was Silas. The giant was trapped in the violent throes of a night terror. His massive, powerful body thrashed violently against the heavy elk hide. The thick timber floorboards groaned under the sudden, explosive shifts of his weight. His broad shoulders twisted in an agonizing struggle against an invisible, crushing force. A sheen of cold sweat gleamed on his rugged, wind-hardened forehead in the dying red light of the hearth. No, the word tore from his throat, ragged and thick with panic. Hold on. Elara shrank back against the heavy wooden headboard, her knuckles turning white. Her nervous system, permanently scarred by the cruel men in her past, screamed at her to hide. An unchained, thrashing man of his immense size was a terrifying force of nature. If one of his flailing, massive arms struck her, it would break her fragile bones. Instinct told her to make herself invisible, to vanish into the shadows until the violence passed. Yet, as she watched the immovable mountain of a man twist in agony, a profound, meaningful, emotional reflection pierced through her own blinding terror. This was the man who had pulled her frozen body from the snow. This was the giant who had purposefully shrunk himself down to the floor, deliberately restraining his immense power just to coax her into drinking a bowl of warm broth. He had given her his fire, his food, his oversized blue flannel shirt, and the very sanctuary of his home. He was a man who spent his waking hours carrying the weight of the world with perfect, stoic control. Now, in the dark, that absolute control had fractured, revealing a deeply wounded soul bleeding out in his sleep. She could not leave him to drown in the dark. Elara pushed the heavy furs aside. Her bruised, delicate feet touched the cold timber floorboards. Her knees trembled, and the oversized flannel shirt swallowed her frail frame as she took a slow, agonizing step toward the hearth. Silas, her voice was a fragile, ruined whisper, entirely swallowed by the erratic, heavy gasps tearing from his chest. She took another step. The heat radiating from the crimson coals washed over her bare legs. He thrashed again, his massive hand sweeping blindly through the air, completely shattering the quiet space. Elara flinched, instinctively squeezing her eyes shut, but she did not retreat. She knelt on the edge of the elk hide. The stark contrast between them was never more apparent. A delicate, starving widow hovering over a towering, immensely powerful woodsman. Silas, please. She reached out. Her trembling, raw fingers hovered over his sweat-drenched, heavy flannel shirt. To touch a man locked in the throes of a violent nightmare was incredibly dangerous. But the sheer, agonizing desperation on his rugged face broke her hesitation. She placed her small, fragile hands firmly against his massive, shifting shoulder. Wake up. His eyes snapped open. They were wild, unseeing, consumed by a blinding, historical panic. In a flash of explosive, terrifying speed, Silas sat up. His massive arm shot forward. His thick, heavily calloused fingers locked around Elara, a delicate wrist like an iron vise. Elara gasped, a sharp cry of shock escaping her throat. She froze instantly, entirely paralyzed by the crushing grip and the sheer, overwhelming proximity of his raw power. The heavy scent of his terrified sweat mixed with the sharp ozone of the mountain air. For one agonizing second, he stared right through her, his chest heaving like a bellows, caught in a world of crushing ice and buried screams. Then, the dim amber light caught the pale, terrified contour of her face. The ghostly reflection of the widow he had sworn to protect pierced through the veil of his nightmare. The realization hit him with the force of a falling timber. Silas released her wrist as if her skin were made of white-hot iron. He scrambled backward, his heavy boots desperately pushing against the floorboards, putting immense physical distance between them. He hit the stone base of the hearth and stopped. He stared at his own massive, trembling hands. He began to flex his thick fingers, closing them into tight fists and opening them again. His quiet, recurring physical ritual of restraint. But this time, the gesture was frantic. It was the desperate, horrifying realization that he had almost hurt the one fragile thing he was trying to save. He buried his rugged, exhausted face into his large hands, his elbows resting heavily on his drawn-up knees. A long, broken shudder racked his broad shoulders. The immovable giant was trembling. "I'm sorry," he breathed. The words, muffled, thick, with a deep, crushing self-loathing. "Am so sorry." Elara remained kneeling on the elk-hide. She looked at her wrist. There was no bruise. His grip had been startling. Yes. But even in the absolute blindness of his night terror, some fundamental instinct within him had refused to exert enough pressure to crush her delicate bones. He had held her, but he had not harmed her. The fear completely evaporated from her chest, replaced by an overwhelming, heavy swell of compassion. She did not retreat to the safety of the bed. She crawled the short distance across the floorboards until she was kneeling directly beside him, in the dim, glowing light of the embers. She folded her delicate legs beneath her, the oversized blue flannel pooling around her knees. Slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away, Elara reached out. She gently placed her small, scarred hand flat against the center of his trembling, broad back. It was a profound reversal of sanctuary. The tiny, broken sparrow, offering shelter to the wounded bear. Silas went entirely rigid at her touch. For years, he had lived in absolute isolation, allowing no one near enough to witness his failures, let alone offer comfort for them. Yet, the gentle, grounding weight of her fragile hand pressing against his spine was an undeniable anchor to reality. "You are safe," Elara murmured softly, echoing the exact words he had given her on that first terrifying night. Her voice was remarkably steady, pouring quiet warmth into the cold, jagged cracks of his armor. "The storm is outside. We are safe inside." Silas slowly lowered his hands, staring blankly at the glowing red coals in the hearth. The erratic, panicked rhythm of his breathing began to match the slow, deliberate pace of her own. He did not move away from her touch. He allowed her hand to remain, a lifeline pulling him out of the freezing dark. "Couldn't he dig them out?" Silas whispered, his deep voice cracking, hollowed out by a decade of unresolved grief. The words were a fragmented, bleeding confession spoken to the fire. The ice. It was too heavy. Couldn't he breathe for them? Elara did not ask him to explain. She did not pry. She simply kept her hand pressed firmly against his back, letting him know that his brokenness did not frighten her away. But as the heavy silence of the cabin reclaimed the night, a profound, terrifying question settled into the quiet space between them. She knew the agony of losing a husband to fever, and she knew the cruelty of greedy men. But what monumental tragedy, what unspeakable failure against the ice, had completely shattered the heart of the strongest man she had ever known? The thaw began not with a roar, but with a singular, crystalline drip. It echoed against the porch planks outside, a rhythmic, persistent heartbeat that heralded the slow death of winter. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a subtle tectonic shift. The barrier of stoic silence had been breached, not by force, but by the shared recognition of their respective ghosts. They were no longer merely a giant protector and a delicate survivor. They were two wreckage-strewn souls, huddled together in the high country dark. Elara found she could stand for longer periods now, her strength returning like the green shoots, pushing through the melting snow. She spent her mornings at the small table, sewing a sturdy, practical apron from the remaining good wool of her shredded dress, her fingers moving with a new quiet purpose. Silas, meanwhile, had begun the laborious process of preparing the cabin's perimeter for the coming spring. He spent his days hauling debris from the roof and inspecting the heavy timber foundations for water damage. His massive frame a constant, comforting presence just beyond the threshold. One afternoon, the heavy biting chill of the cabin interior was replaced by a surprising golden warmth. Silas pushed the door wide, inviting the crisp, pine-scented air to flush out the stale remnants of winter. He returned from the woodshed with a bundle of willow branches, their tips swollen with the promise of buds. He didn't head for the hearth or his tools. He walked to the center of the room and, with a few precise, skillful strokes of his knife, fashioned a makeshift vase from a discarded length of cedar pipe. He placed the willow branches inside, the soft, fuzzy catkins catching the slanting sunlight. He set the arrangement on the low table near where Elara sat. It was an entirely unnecessary, beautiful gesture. It was a gift of hope. Elara looked up from her sewing, her gray eyes reflecting the soft light of the buds. A genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips for the first time, a transformation that shifted the entire landscape of her face, washing away the remnants of her chronic sorrow. Silas watched her, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the expression. He stood by the doorway, his massive shoulders blocking the light, his expression unreadable. But a faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his jaw. He had spent years believing that the only things that thrived under his care were the ones he had already failed. Seeing her smile, witnessing the return of her light, felt like a silent, miraculous validation of his own existence. "The valley will be clear of mud by next moon," he murmured, his voice low and rich, vibrating with a tone he had never used before. Elara reached out, her delicate fingers brushing the soft, fuzzy surface of a willow catkin. "It is beautiful." "Thank you." The moment hung between them, thick with the weight of unspoken realizations. The fear of his nightmares and the terror of her past had created a crucible of intimacy, forging a bond that felt impossible to break. She was no longer just the woman he protected. She was a woman he was learning to see, and she, in turn, was learning to see the man behind the wall. He stepped toward the table, reaching out to adjust a stray branch. As he did, his massive, heavily calloused hand accidentally brushed against the back of her small, fragile one. The contact was electric. Elara didn't pull away. She felt the surprising, grounding warmth of his skin, the strength embedded in every line of his hand. Silas didn't recoil either. He held his position, his hand lingering for a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary, a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the shift in their dynamic. It was the first tentative bridge of physical touch, a gesture that spoke of comfort, of reliance, and of a burgeoning, fragile longing that neither dared to name. Then, from the vast, deep silence of the valley below, an echo rolled upward. It was a sharp, metallic clack, followed by the distant, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves against hard, unfrozen ground. Silas went rigid. The softness in his gaze vanished instantly, replaced by a razor-sharp, predatory focus. He surged toward the door, his massive frame filling the frame as he squinted into the distance. The sound did not belong to the natural world. It was the synchronized, deliberate gait of a small party of riders, Men who were not mountain folk. Men who moved with the arrogant, steady pace of those who believed they owned the earth. Elara stood, her heart slamming against her ribs, the warmth of the moment shattered by the sudden, freezing intrusion of the world she had fled. She hurried to the doorway, stopping just behind Silas' massive back. Below, winding along the narrow, treacherous pass that led toward the base of the mountains, were 3 riders. Even from this height, they looked like dark, ink-stained blots against the budding green of the forest. They moved with purpose, their heads bent together, stopping occasionally to scan the ground with a methodical, predatory patience. They weren't merely travelers. They were hunters. Silas's jaw tightened, the muscles corded beneath his thick beard like coiled wire. He knew that pace. He knew that tactical spacing. Those were men who tracked, who searched, and who did not stop until they reached their prize. "Get away from the door," he ordered, his voice stripped of all its warmth. Now, a cold, steel-edged command. Elara didn't argue. She felt the blood drain from her face. The familiar, icy grip of the Quinn family's reach clawing at her throat. She stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, her hands trembling as she clutched the apron she had been sewing. Silas remained in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes tracking the riders until they disappeared into the dense, shadowed timber of the lower canyon. He didn't turn back immediately. He stood there, a guardian carved from granite, staring into the path of the approaching threat. When he finally pulled the door shut, he didn't bolt it. He reached for his heavy hunting rifle, checking the chamber with a rhythmic, practiced motion that felt terrifyingly final. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Elara saw a flicker of genuine, unconcealed panic in his piercing blue eyes. Not for himself, but for her. "They have found the base of the mountain," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Elara walked toward him, her footsteps light on the floorboards. She stopped just out of his reach, the fragile, blossoming hope of the willow branches now feeling like a cruel, mocking memory. "They will come up the trail," she whispered, her voice heavy with the certainty of her doom. Silas looked at her, his massive frame looming over her, his expression a dark, turbulent storm. He had promised to keep her safe, to provide sanctuary, to be the shield that blocked the world. But as he looked at the delicate, vulnerable widow standing before him, he realized with a sickening clarity that the wall he had built was not high enough. "They will not take you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vow that resonated through the cabin walls. Not while Mort draw breath. He stepped past her, moving to the cedar chest to retrieve a heavy roll of hide and gear. He began to pack, his movements frantic, stripped of their usual, deliberate calm. He was preparing to move them. He was preparing to run. But as Elara watched him pack, a devastating, paralyzing thought surfaced in her mind. If he fled with her, if he abandoned his mountain, he would be branding himself an outcast alongside her. He would be losing his own sanctuary, his only true home, to save a woman he had only known for a few short weeks. "Silas," she called out, her voice trembling but resolute. He didn't stop packing, his back to her, his shoulders hunched with the weight of 1,000 unspoken burdens. "Why?" she whispered, the question tearing at the very fabric of their fragile connection. "Why would you sacrifice everything for a stranger who only brought you trouble?" Silas stopped his work. He didn't turn around. He stood there, absolutely still, the heavy pack lying open on the bed before him. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating, until it seemed the very walls were leaning in to hear his answer. What could he say? That she was the first person in a decade who hadn't looked at him and seen a failure. That her presence had been the only light in the long, dark tunnel of his own self-loathing. that protecting her had become the only thing that allowed him to look at his own reflection without flinching. He turned slowly to face her, his piercing blue eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "You did not bring trouble, Elara," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all artifice. "You brought the only life Mort have had in 10 years. The confession hung in the air. A profound, life-altering truth that demanded a response. But before she could speak, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a rifle shot cracked against the silence of the mountain, echoing violently off the canyon walls. The hunters were no longer tracking. They were signaling. And they were much closer than Silas had anticipated. The gunshot reverberated off the granite cliffs like a thunderclap, a violent punctuation mark that tore the mountain air to shreds. Silence returned immediately, heavier and more dangerous than before. Silas moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that belied his massive bulk. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides, his hand locking onto the heavy iron bar of the door. He didn't bolt it. He slid it into place with a definitive, harsh clack. "To the back," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl of focused intent. Elara didn't hesitate. She fled toward the rear of the cabin, the heavy wool of her apron snagging on the rough-hewn table. Silas was right behind her, his hand moving to the wall where a heavy, leather-bound pack and a bundle of furs sat pre-staged. He shoved the items into her arms, his gaze intense and unyielding. "The high ridge," he whispered, gesturing to the small, concealed trapdoor in the corner of the floorboards, an escape route he had clearly maintained for years, though he had never once alluded to it. "Take the trail that leads to the northern shelf. Do not stop, do not look back. If you hear a whistle, 2 short, 1 long, you keep climbing. If you hear nothing, you stay hidden until the moon sets." Elara clutched the pack to her chest, her knuckles white. She looked at his face, searching for the stoic, impenetrable mask he usually wore. But she found something else entirely. There was a raw, searing vulnerability in his blue eyes, a desperate, naked fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. "Come with me," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Silas, we go together." He shook his head once. A sharp, decisive motion. "They are looking for a trail, not a ghost. Moat will lead them away, toward the southern ravine. They will follow the noise, and you will be miles above them." "You lying," she whispered, her intuition cutting through his calm facade like a razor. "You aren't just leading them away. You going to fight them. You going to stay." He didn't answer. He simply reached out and caught her chin with his thumb and forefinger, forcing her to look at him. His skin was rough, calloused, and radiated a heat that seemed to ground her entire world. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, desperate second. It was the first time he had ever truly breached the distance between them, and the act felt more like an admission than a caress. "Go," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "Mort will find you. Moat have never failed to track what is mine." He shoved her toward the trapdoor. Elara scrambled down into the dark, narrow tunnel, the smell of damp earth and pine roots choking her. She heard the heavy thud of the trapdoor closing above her, followed by the muffled, rhythmic sound of Silas moving furniture. He was barricading the cabin. He was turning his sanctuary into a tomb. She crawled through the cold, cramped darkness of the tunnel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She emerged 100 yards away, hidden behind a thick, impenetrable wall of dense evergreen boughs. The world outside was cold and smelled of impending rain. She stood, shivering, and looked toward the cabin. The smoke from the chimney was still curling lazily into the sky. A peaceful, mocking sight. She turned and began to climb. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest. but the memory of his touch, the intensity in his blue eyes, kept her moving. She reached the first limestone ledge and paused, hidden by the shadow of an overhanging rock. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the winding trail below. A moment later, the riders emerged from the tree line. There were 3 of them, just as Silas had seen. They were mounted on sturdy, travel-hardened horses, their coats slick with sweat. The man in the lead was tall, his hat pulled low, his posture radiating an arrogant, predatory ease. He stopped his horse, gesturing toward the cabin with his riding crop. Elara's breath hitched. She recognized the tilt of his head, the way he sat in the saddle. It was Julian Quinn, her brother-in-law. The sight of him brought the taste of copper to her mouth. She remembered the nights in the guest quarters, the smell of his expensive tobacco, the cold, clinical way he had spoken of her, as if she were a piece of furniture to be liquidated. Julian signaled to his men. 2 of them dismounted, their rifles drawn and held at the ready. They approached the cabin with cautious, calculated steps, their eyes scanning the windows. Elara held her breath, her hand pressed against the cold stone of the cliff. She watched as one of the men raised his boot and kicked the heavy timber door. It didn't budge. He kicked it again, and then, with a splintering, deafening crack, the wood gave way. She watched them surge inside, their forms disappearing into the darkness of the room where she had been healed, where she had learned the language of silence, where she had begun to heal the jagged wounds of her own soul. Minutes passed, an eternity of silence. Then, the back door of the cabin exploded outward. A massive figure erupted from the rear, a blur of motion that dived into the dense thicket of the ravine. It was Silas. He moved with a feral, terrifying grace, his rifle slung across his back, his hands empty. "There!" a voice shrieked from inside the cabin. Julian and his men burst through the splintered doorway, firing blindly into the trees. Silas didn't fire back. He kept running, his massive frame leaping over fallen logs and jagged rocks, purposefully drawing their fire toward the south, directly away from the northern shelf where Elara was hidden. "He's running." "Get him," Julian screamed, his voice sounding thin and distorted against the vast scale of the mountain. The men remounted, their horses rearing and thrashing as they plunged into the ravine, following the giant. Elara watched them fade from view, the sound of their pursuit swallowed by the wilderness. She was alone on the high ridge, safe, protected by his sacrifice. But as the realization of what he had done truly settled in, the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Silas had not just left his home. He had exposed his own deepest secret. She remembered the way the Quinn men had looked at the cabin, not as a place of discovery, but as a place they expected to find someone. She pulled the pack he had given her tight against her chest. Her fingers brushed against the side, feeling a hard, rectangular object tucked into a side pocket. She reached in and pulled it out. It was a bundle of letters, bound in twine, and a hand-drawn map of the region. The ink faded by time. She untied the twine. The letters were addressed to Silas. They weren't from a lover or a friend. They were from a bank in the nearest town, and they were stamped with a red, ominous seal, foreclosure pending. Below the letters, she found a news clipping, yellowed and brittle. It was a headline from 5 years ago. Mountain guide Silas Vance cleared of negligence in tragic avalanche that claimed 4 lives. The article went on to detail the lawsuit, the settlement that had stripped him of his family's ranch, and the public shaming that had driven him to the high country. Elara sat on the hard, cold stone, the world spinning. The midpoint shift had occurred, not in the landscape, but in her understanding of the man who had saved her. He hadn't been living in the high country because he wanted to be alone. He was living in exile, a man who had already lost everything to the very same type of men who were now hunting her. He hadn't just saved a widow. He had defended a woman who represented the only thing he had ever fought for and lost. She looked up at Moaf, the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to prick through the gloom. Silas was out there, alone, with 3 armed men who would stop at nothing to take her back. He had lied to her. He had shielded her from the truth of his own ruin, perhaps thinking she wouldn't to trust a man so thoroughly defeated by the world. She stood, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She could stay on the shelf. She couldn't wait for him to come back. She had been a prisoner of the Quinns for too long. She had been a delicate, suffering widow for too long. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs with a renewed, searing clarity. She didn't head for the northern path. She turned, looked down toward the dark, dangerous ravine where the hunters had disappeared, and began to descend. She was no longer the woman who fainted on his doorstep. She was the woman who carried his secret, his history, and now, his future. And if he was going to fight the Quinns, he wouldn't be doing it alone. As she navigated the treacherous slope, a terrifying sound erupted from the forest floor, a low, pained howl that sounded distinctly human. It was followed by the cold, mechanical sound of a rifle being cocked. The hunt was turning. But who was the predator? And who was the prey? The descent into the ravine was an act of madness. Elara moved vekepitehat, a desperate, frantic energy, sliding down embankments of loose shale and grabbing at exposed tree roots until her palms bled. The forest below was a tangle of deep shadow and jagged silhouettes, a labyrinth that Silas knew intimately, but which felt like a closing trap to her. Every snapping teve kep iga sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of the wind through the pines echoed the menace of the hunters. She reached the floor of the ravine, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The air here was heavy with the metallic tang of wet stone and the cloying scent of pine sap. She moved toward the sound, that harrowing, human cry that had splintered the stillness. She found him beneath a cluster of ancient, moss-draped hemlocks. Silas was slumped against the trunk of a massive fallen cedar, his rugged face pale and slick with cold sweat. His massive frame, usually so solid and immovable, looked diminished, hunched over in a posture of profound, agonizing struggle. His heavy canvas jacket was torn at the shoulder. The rough wool of his shirt stained a dark, ominous crimson. Elara did not think, she acted. She dropped to her knees in the mud, her hands hovering over him, terrified that the slightest touch might shatter the remaining strength in his body. "Silas," she gasped, her voice a fractured whisper. His head lolled, his eyes unfocused and swimming with pain. When he finally locked onto her, a flash of pure, unadulterated shock crossed his rugged features. "Elara," he gritted out, the effort forcing a sharp, jagged exhale from his lips. You were supposed to climb. You were supposed to be safe." She didn't waste time on words. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her apron, the heavy wool coarse and sturdy, and pressed it firmly against the wound in his shoulder. Silas winced, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest, but he did not pull away. His massive, calloused hand came up to cover hers, pinning her smaller hand to his body. "Why?" he breathed, his voice raw. "Why come back to the fire?" Elara looked into those piercing blue eyes, the eyes that had watched her, protected her, and held her when the world felt too heavy to bear. She saw the truth of the letters and the news clipping she had found. She saw the man who had lost everything and yet still had enough honor to die for a stranger. Because you are not a failure, she said, her voice steady, defying the tremors racking her own body. And you are not alone. Silas stared at her, his gaze searching hers, his breathing ragged and labored. The intensity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. It was a mixture of gratitude, agony, and a terrifying, dawning realization that the walls he had built were finally, irrevocably, crumbling. They are close, he warned, his tone regaining a sliver of its usual iron-willed edge. They are backtracking. They know Mort doubled back. Then we move, Elara said, already looking for a way to leverage his immense weight. Mort cannot walk. Elara. Then Mort will hold you up, she retorted, her voice hard with a resilience she had not known she possessed. She stood, bracing her shoulder beneath his good arm. Silas hesitated, a flicker of pride fighting against his physical need. But as another wave of pain washed over him, he leaned his massive, heavy frame against her. The weight of him was immense, grounding, a physical reminder of the mountain itself. They moved slowly, a mismatched pair stumbling through the dark, jagged landscape. Every step was an agony for him, a test of her resolve. They avoided the open ground, sticking to the shadows of the rock faces, the silence of the forest their only cover. They reached a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock wall, a place Silas had used for trapping in his early days. He guided her toward it, his steps becoming increasingly unsteady. They slipped into the darkness of the crevice, huddled together on a bed of dry, needle-strewn earth. Silas slumped back, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Elara worked in the dark, using the remains of her apron to tighten the bandage, her movements efficient and devoid of hesitation. The intimacy of the moment was profound, the shared, rapid heartbeat, the warmth of his blood on her hands, the absolute necessity of their proximity. The Quinns, she said, her voice low as she worked. They aren't just looking for me, Silas. They want the papers. They know about the inheritance, about the truth of what they did to Thomas. Silas went still. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom. Mort found the letters. Elara. Mort know what you've been carrying. She paused, her fingers still against his arm. Then you know why Mort had to run. They didn't just want me as a wife. They wanted me to sign away the title to the valley, to finalize the theft. Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. Mort thought you were a victim of a cruel marriage. Mort did not realize you were the target of a cold-blooded heist. Does it change what you think of me? She asked, her voice hovering in the dark. Silas reached out, his hand finding her face in the dark. His thumb brushed over her cheek, a touch so light it was almost a ghost of a sensation. It changes everything, he whispered. Mort thought Mort was protecting a widow. Mort was protecting a woman who held the power to destroy the very men who have haunted me for 5 years. The revelation hung in the cold, damp air. Silas had been hunted by the same shadow as her, separated by different tragedies but bound by the same cruel greed. Suddenly, a voice drifted into the fissure, muffled by the stone. Mort know you in there. Vance. You bleeding. You leaving a trail a blind man could follow. It was Julian. His voice was cold, polished, and carried the effortless malice of a man who had never known a day of hunger or defeat. Silas tensed, his hand sliding to the hunting knife at his belt. Elara felt the surge of protective instinct in him, the way he shifted his body to put himself between her and the entrance. Stay behind me, he breathed. Elara didn't move. She stood beside him, her hand gripping his sleeve. refusing to be relegated to the shadows. "There are 3 of them," she whispered. "If we move, if we make a sound, they look fire into the dark." "Then we wait," Silas muttered, his eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight, illuminating the entrance. But as they waited, the air in the fissure grew heavy. Silas's breathing began to hitch again, and a cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. The wound was worse than he had admitted, and the shock was beginning to take its toll on his massive, resilient body. He leaned his head against the cold stone, his eyes closing, his grip on his knife loosening. "Silas," Elara whispered, grabbing his hand. "Don't you dare leave me now." He opened his eyes, his gaze cloudy. Moat-am fading. "Elara." "No," she said, her voice rising in a fierce, desperate rhythm. "You are the mountain. You are the giant who does not fall. Stay with me." She leaned in, her forehead pressing against his, her breath mingling with his cold, metallic scent. She was no longer just the woman he had saved. She was the anchor he was holding onto for dear life. Outside, a footfall crunched on the gravel. Closer now. Julian's voice drifted in again, taunting, confident. "Come out, Vance. We look make it quick for you. And as for the widow, she's far more valuable to us alive." Silas' fingers tightened on her hand. A final, flickering spark of defiance. He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the pain vanished, replaced by an expression of raw, unvarnished longing that made her heart ache. "If they come," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you run." "You don't look back. You promise me." Elara didn't answer. She took his knife from his loosening grip and held it, her own eyes fixed on the entrance. She had learned how to survive the cold. She had learned how to face her fears. And now, she would learn how to fight for the man who had given her a reason to live. But as the silhouette of a man appeared against the moonlight, Elara felt the weight of the moment. They were pinned in the dark. The giant was falling, and the hunters had finally reached the threshold of their sanctuary. The silhouette filled the fisher's mouth, blotting out the pale wash of moonlight. He was a creature of sharp angles and expensive wool, a stark contrast to the rough, moss-covered reality of the mountain. Julian Quinn paused, his boots scraping against the loose shale. He held a revolver low, his posture relaxed, the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Elara stood, her knees screaming in protest, the hunting knife heavy and unfamiliar in her grip. Her breath was a shallow, controlled stream of air. Beside her, Silas was a dead weight against the stone, his breathing a wet, ragged rasp that seemed to fill the small space. If Julian heard it, he would know the giant was broken. "Elara," the man drawled, his voice smooth, possessing the polished, terrifying cadence of the manor. "Do not be difficult. It is beneath you. Your brother-in-law is here to bring you home." Elara stepped forward, forcing herself into the thin sliver of moonlight. She did not tremble. She did not cower. She kept the knife low, hidden by the folds of her apron, and projected a calm she did not feel. "Home," her voice was steady, cutting through the damp, stagnant air of the fissure. "You mean the cold stone of the guest quarters? The cage you built with my own husband's fortune?" Julian stopped. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features. He had expected a weeping, terrified girl. He had not expected the widow to possess a voice that carried the steel of the mountains. He stepped closer, squinting into the gloom, trying to discern her position. You have been listening to campfire tales. My dear, he murmured, his fingers tightening on the grip of his pistol. You are confused. You are grieving. The mountain air has rotted your sense of reality. Mort have the letters. Julian, she lied, her voice rising, ringing with a conviction that demanded to be heard. The ones from the bank. The ones that prove you forged Thomas's debts. If Mott die here, those papers go to the magistrate in town. They are already waiting for my return. It was a gamble, a desperate, terrifying bluff, but the way Julian's eyes narrowed, the way he hesitated, told her she had struck a nerve. He wanted the papers. He needed them destroyed to cement his control over the valley. You have nothing, he spat, his composure fracturing, his arrogance replaced by a jagged, hungry greed. You are a vagrant, a scavenger clinging to a mountain hermit. Mort am the only heir, she countered, taking a single, slow step toward him, forcing him to retreat. And if you want your fortune, you will leave. Now. Before Mort give the order to the men waiting on the ridge. She didn't look at the empty darkness behind her. She didn't look at Silas. She kept her gaze locked on Julian S., projecting the absolute certainty of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Julian glanced toward the ridge, his eyes darting into the shadowed abyss of the night. He was a man of ledgers and law, a coward who relied on intimidation and proxies. He did not know how to fight a ghost in the dark. He did not know if Silas was truly alone, or if the mountain held other secrets. He cursed. A low, vicious sound. You will not survive the night. Elara. The mountain will take what Mort cannot. He backed out, the moonlight flooding the entrance once more. The sound of his retreating boots on the shale was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. She didn't wait. She lunged forward, grabbing a heavy, loose rock and shoving it into the fissure's opening, blocking the view, and then she collapsed back against the stone wall, the hunting knife slipping from her nerveless fingers. The silence rushed back in, but it was shattered by the sound of Silas' labored breathing. Elara, he croaked, his voice barely a vibration in the dark. She crawled to him, her hands trembling violently, now that the adrenaline had bled away. She pressed her palm against his forehead. It was burning, a terrifying dry heat that radiated off his skin like a furnace. The infection was setting in, moving through his veins with a speed that defied the cold. You are here, he whispered, his eyes fluttering open to find her face in the gloom. You were a lioness. Elara let out a choked, or tearful laugh, pressing her forehead against his. Mapot am just a widow. Silas. A widow who refuses to lose her anchor. She spent the next hour working with a focus that bordered on mania. She gathered the dry moss from the fissure's floor to build a bedding for him, moving him with a strength born of pure, desperate necessity. She cleaned the wound again, using the last of the clean water in her canteen, binding it as tightly as she could with the remains of her apron. The intimacy of the task was suffocating. Every brush of her fingers against his skin, every agonizing moan he emitted, every time he gripped her hand to steady himself, deepened the chasm of their shared reality. They were no longer protector and protected. They were two people, stripped of every illusion, fighting for a single, shared breath. As the moon began to set, casting the world into a deep, impenetrable indigo, Silas grew quiet. The fever-dream delirium began to claim him, his mind drifting into the dark, jagged landscape of his past. The snow was so heavy, he murmured, his voice thick, and his gaze fixed on the ceiling of the cave. Seeing ghosts, she could not. Mutt tried to pull them out. Moat tried. But the ice. It didn't care about my hands. It didn't care about my strength. Elara brushed the damp hair from his forehead, her heart breaking for the man who believed his strength was a curse. You did what you could. Silas, she whispered, her voice a soothing, rhythmic balm. The mountain is cruel. You are not. He turned his head, his piercing blue eyes searching hers, his gaze suddenly clear, stripped of all defenses. He reached up at his large, calloused hand cupping her face. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the chill of the cavern. You, he breathed. The word a confession that carried more weight than 1,000 promises. You were the one thing Moot didn't fail. The weight of his words settled in her chest. A profound, terrifying anchor. She knew that if he died here, in this dark fissure, he would die believing he had finally succeeded, that his final act had been to save her. You haven't failed me, she said, tears hot and fast on her cheeks. And you will not leave me. Do you hear me? Silas Vance. Mort do not know these mountains. Mort do not know how to find the valley. If you close your eyes, Moat am lost. She gripped his hand, holding it against her cheek, refusing to let him drift away. But as the night wore on, the silence outside began to change. The wind shifted, bringing the sharp aprimsmust, metallic scent of snow. The temperature in the fissure plummeted. Silas's breathing became erratic, shallow, a terrifying staccato rhythm that signaled the limits of his endurance. Elara pulled the elk hide over them both, huddling close to his massive frame, trying to shield him with her own body heat. She felt the shivers racking his muscles, the way his jaw clenched against the cold, and the horrifying realization washed over her. He was losing the battle against his own body. She looked up at the fissure entrance, the sky beginning to gray with the first hint of dawn. They were still alive. They had outwitted Julian. But the mountain was closing in, and the giant was falling. She needed a fire. She needed medicine. She needed to get him off the mountain, or the very sanctuary that had brought them together would become their grave. She looked down at him, his face etched with the lines of his exhaustion, and made a silent, ferocious vow. She would not let the ice take him. She would carry him. She would drag him. She would crawl with him if she had to, but he would not die in the dark. As the light grew stronger, revealing the harsh, unforgiving stone walls of their prison, a distant sound carried on the wind, not the rhythmic thud of a horse, but the guttural, hunting call of a wolf pack. The mountain had its own predators, and they had smelled the scent of blood on the wind. The howls were not distant. They were distinct, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close. They tore through the crisp, pre-dawn air, vibrating against the limestone walls of the fissure. Elara didn't panic. The paralysis of her past had been burned away by the fires of the last few days. She scrambled to the entrance of the cave, grabbing the scattered pine boughs and dry kindling she had gathered the previous evening. With trembling, frantic fingers, she struck her small flint against the steel, the spark catching on a dried bird's nest she had tucked beneath the wood. A plume of acrid gray smoke curled upward, followed by a bright, dancing lick of flame. She fed it the remaining scrap of leather from her pack, watching as the fire took hold, casting long, flickering shadows against the rock. It was a pathetic, small light, but to the predatory eyes in the dark, it was a barrier of artificial human heat. Behind her, Silas shifted. A low, ragged groan escaped his lips. A sound of profound, physical disorientation. Elara hurried back to his side. The fever had not broken. It had settled into his bones, glazing his piercing blue eyes with a glassy, unfocused sheen. He looked at her, but he did not seem to see her. He saw a ghost, a shimmering mirage of the life he had lost. or perhaps a dream of the one he had tried to build. The ice, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the small fire. Elara. The ice is moving. You have to go. I'm not going anywhere, she murmured, wiping the cold sweat from his rugged, stubbled jaw. They will come, he whispered, his hand blindly reaching out to grasp her wrist. His grip was weak, a shocking, painful reminder of the giant's rapidly failing strength. The wolves the men. The mountain. You are the only thing that didn't break. If you stay, you break. He was trying to protect her. Even in the depths of his delirium, even with death rattling in his chest, his singular defining instinct was to excise her from his life, to shield her from his own encroaching end. It was the ultimate, misplaced act of love, and it burned Elara more sharply than the freezing wind. "I'm not breaking," she said, her voice hard, resonant with a newfound, tempered authority. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, forcing him to focus on her. "You are not the mountain, Silas. You are a man. And you are my man. We do not leave the fallen behind." She didn't wait for his permission. She forced him to swallow a few sips of the remaining water, mixing it with the last of the dried berries she had scavenged. He fought her, his strength failing him, his protective instincts lashing out in a confusion of delirium and fear. He tried to push her away, his massive hand sweeping through the air with a sluggish, uncoordinated movement that nearly knocked over their meager fire. "Get out!" he shouted, a flash of his old, commanding, stoic power surging through the fever. "Leave this place." "That is an order." Elara didn't flinch. She grabbed his flailing hand, pinning it firmly against his chest. "They kept ite hot, both of hers." She let him feel the frantic, undeniable rhythm of her own heart. "You do not command me," she said, her voice low, dangerous, and utterly resolute. "You invited me into your sanctuary. You shared your fire. And you held me when the world tried to crush me. You do not get to cast me out now, just because you are afraid of failing one more time." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the howling of the pack outside, now pacing the perimeter of the scent of fire. Silas stared at her, his breathing slowing, the raw, unvarnished longing in his eyes pierced through the haze of the fever. He realized in that moment that his attempt to push her away had not been a shielding act. It had been an insult. He had been trying to control her fate because he could not bear the responsibility of her survival. He sagged back against the stone, his hand finally relaxing under hers. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes. A single, hot tear tracking through the dirt on his cheek. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "Then rest," she replied, her voice softening, the sharp edges of her defiance melting into a profound, aching tenderness. "Moat will keep watch." She spent the remainder of the dawn in a state of hyper-vigilance. She fed the fire with microscopic precision, nursing the flame, and every time the wolves howled, she stood at the entrance, clutching the hunting knife. A solitary, fragile sentry, guarding the giant's sleep. She felt a shift in the air. The mountain was changing. The storm was not coming back, but the winter was holding on with a desperate, freezing grip. By midday, the wolves had moved on, uninterested in the challenge of the fire. Silas's fever had peaked and begun to recede, leaving him in a state of hollowed-out, terrifying stillness. He opened his eyes, the glassy haze gone, replaced by a deep, weary clarity. He looked at the meager fire, then at Elara, who was sitting cross-legged by the entrance, her face smudged with soot, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion. "How long?" he asked, 6 hours since dawn. He tried to sit up, but the effort brought a wince of pure, crystalline pain to his features. He stopped, his breathing ragged. "We need to move," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its gravelly strength. "The trail leads toward the lower pass. If we can reach the trading post, there is a doctor." Elara moved to his side, her touch familiar and unhesitating. She helped him sit, her shoulder acting as a brace. "You cannot walk," she stated. "Mote have to," he replied, looking at her with a stark, terrifying intensity. "Because if we stay here, and the Quinns double back, you will have no way to run." The conflict of his protective instinct flared again. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, looking for the fear he assumed she should feel. "You don't trust me to stay, do you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You think that if Mort am not running, Mort am in danger?" "Moot know the men who are hunting you," Silas said, his jaw tightening. "They are not men who negotiate. They are men who erase. And Mort will not have you erased, because Mort am too weak to walk you to safety. Mort am not just running." "Silas," she said, her hands moving to the map she had recovered from his pack. She spread it out on the flat stones between them. "Moat am going to stop them." She traced a line on the map, her finger lingering on a narrow, treacherous shortcut that bypassed the main pass. "If we take the Devil's Tongue, we can reach the valley by dusk. We don't go to the trading post. We go to the magistrate. The letters Mort have. They are enough to trigger a formal audit of the Quinn estate. If we present them ourselves, we take the power out of Julian's hands." Silas stared at the map, then back at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, not the fear of a victim, but the cold, calculating intelligence of a woman who had spent months observing her captors and now knew their weaknesses better than they knew their own. He realized, with a shock that eclipsed his physical pain, that he had been protecting a woman who did not need his sword. She needed his presence. He reached out, his hand covering hers on the map. His grip was still trembling, but there was a new, profound steadiness in his touch. "The Devil's Tongue is a vertical climb," he warned, his voice low, testing her resolve. "It will require everything you have. You will be exhausted. You will be exposed. And Mott will be a weight around your neck." "You are not a weight," she whispered, her voice a soft, final argument. "You are the mountain, and Mortem the one who climbs." She stood, grabbing his good arm and pulling him to his feet. Silas gasped, his knees buckling, but she held him, her small frame braced against his massive, broken one. He leaned into her, the realization of his dependence on her finally settling over him not as a failure, but as a bridge. They took their first step out of the fissure. The sunlight was blinding, white and merciless, reflecting off the snow as they stepped onto the narrow, treacherous path. Silas looked down at her, really looked at her, and saw for the first time that the delicate widow he had pulled from the snow had been forged into something harder, stronger, and more resilient than the rock beneath their boots. But as they rounded the first bend of the trail, the path ahead vanished. A landslide, triggered by the thawing melt, had sheared away the mountainside, leaving a 20-foot gap of sheer, impossible drop. They were trapped. And from the direction of the canyon below, the distinct, rhythmic clatter of horses began to rise, growing louder ve capite hot every passing heartbeat. The hunters had not abandoned the trail. They had simply waited for them to come down. The rhythmic clatter of hooves against the shale grew louder, a percussive, encroaching doom that vibrated through the soles of Elara boots. Below them, a few hundred feet down the steep, jagged slope, the trail remained open. But above and ahead, the landslide had turned the Devil's Tongue into a dead end, a sheer, unforgiving drop into the mist-choked canyon floor. Silas leaned heavily against the cold, unyielding granite, his breathing a harsh, whistling rattle. He looked at the gap, then at the steep, loose slope that led down toward the main trail, where the riders would inevitably appear. "They have us," he murmured, his voice drained of its usual gravelly depth. "The trail cuts back in 100 yards. If we stay here, they will see us from the switchback below. If we try to cross the slide, we will fall." Elara didn't look at the drop. She looked at him. His face was gray, the color of vecapite ash, and his eyes, usually so piercing and alert, were clouded with the exhaustion of a man who had reached the absolute edge of his capability. She felt the heavy, devastating weight of his body against hers, a burden she refused to set down. "We are not staying here," she said, her voice cutting through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She scanned the wall behind them. High above, hidden by the overhang of a craggy outcropping, was a narrow fissure, no more than a sliver of darkness in the rock. It was impossible to reach, requiring a leap of faith across the slide, or a precarious traverse along the cliff's edge. "That ledge," she pointed, her finger trembling slightly. "It connects to the old trapping route. If we can reach it, we can disappear into the high rocks." Silas followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "It is a 10-foot climb up the face. Elara. With my weight, with this wound, we will fall before we take the first step. Then we don't climb it," she countered, the steel returning to her spine. She reached into her pack, pulling out the length of heavy, braided elk hide rope she had insisted on packing before they left the cave. "We secure ourselves. Mort, go first. Mort, find a hold. And Mort, pull. You push." It was a preposterous plan, a desperate, life-threatening gamble. But as Silas looked into her face, suited, scraped, yet burning with a fierce, quiet intensity, he felt the last of his resistance dissolve. He had spent his life convinced that he was the savior, the protector, the one who held the strength of the mountain. He realized now that he had been wrong. She was the one who had been carrying the weight all along. He nodded. A slow, jerky motion of surrender. Elara moved with a speed born of pure survival. She tied the rope around his waist, then lashed the other end to her own, leaving just enough slack to allow them to move independently, but remain tethered. She scrambled toward the cliff face, her fingers searching for purchase in the cold, unyielding stone. She found a hold. She pulled. Her muscles burned, her fingers raw and bleeding. But she hauled herself up, finding the narrow shelf with a grunt of exertion. She turned, her breath coming in jagged gasps, and looked down. Silas was waiting, his arms raised, his face twisted in a mask of agonizing effort. He reached for her, his massive hand closing around her forearm, his grip firm despite the tremors that racked his frame. The proximity was absolute. As he pushed himself up, her body pressed hard against the rock, his chest flush against hers, his scent, pine, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of his own blood, enveloping her completely. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The sound of the horses, the threat of the Quins, the terrifying height, it all vanished. There was only the heat radiating from him, the solid, unyielding strength of his frame, and the silent, burning longing in his eyes. He held her, his hand cradling the back of her head, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that tore the breath from her lungs. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was a confession, a desperate, aching admission that he saw her not as a widow, but as the only things in this world that made his own. worth more than the cold stone he inhabited. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You should have left me," he breathed. His voice, a low, gravelly vibration that echoed in her very marrow. "You should have saved yourself." "More than saving myself," she whispered, her hands clutching the front of his flannel shirt, drawing him into her space, refusing to let him retreat into his self-imposed exile. "More than saving us." A sharp, metallic clack echoed from the trail below. The riders had rounded the bend. The intimacy of the moment shattered. Silas's expression hardened, his eyes snapping toward the sound. "Up," he commanded, his voice returning to its iron-willed edge. "They are at the turn." He pushed himself up, his muscles bunching as he hauled his massive weight over the edge of the shelf. They tumbled onto the narrow, rocky ledge, scrambling into the shadows of the outcropping. Just as the first horse head appeared on the trail below, they crouched in the dark, the wall of stone pressing against their backs. Below, they could hear the soft, muffled voices of the men. Vance, Julian's voice drifted up, echoing off the canyon walls with a mocking, cruel cadence. "Moat know you up here. Moat can smell your fear." Silas didn't move. He kept his hand over Elara's mouth, his body shielding her from the sightline of the trail. The contact was electric. Their legs tangled, their hearts hammering in a synchronized, terrified rhythm. She felt his pulse, rapid and shallow, against her skin. She felt the way he leaned into her, his body acting as a living, breathing barricade against the world. It was a position of extreme, agonizing vulnerability. One wrong move, one sharp breath, and they would be seen. But, in the dark, pressed against the cold rock, Elara felt something else, the realization that the feeble widow he had rescued was, in his eyes, now his equal. He didn't hold her to contain her. He held her to protect the most precious thing he had ever known. Julian moved further down the trail, his voice fading. But as he passed directly beneath their perch, he stopped. He pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes scanning the cliff face, the sunlight glinting off the polished barrel of his rifle. Silas froze, his muscles locking, his hand tightening slightly on Elara's shoulder. He held his breath, waiting, listening. Then, Julian shifted his weight. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the rocks above. "There," he muttered, pointing toward the very outcropping where they were hidden. Silas reached for his knife, his gaze dropping to Elara. There was a finality in his eyes, a silent, devastating message that made her heart stop. He was preparing to draw their fire, to jump from the ledge and lure them away, to make the final, fatal sacrifice he had intended to make from the very beginning. He moved his hand away from her mouth, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a desperate, quiet plea for her to survive. "If not jump," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a thought. "You climb. You don't look back. You promise me." Elara gripped his wrist, her eyes blazing with a defiance that silenced him. She didn't let go. She leaned in, her lips inches from his, her voice a fierce, dangerous whisper. "If you jump," she breathed, "you die alone. Because Mott will be right behind you." The tension in his arm vanished, replaced by a shock that held him motionless. He stared at her. The giant, the hermit, the mountain man, utterly undone by the small, fragile woman who refused to let him go. But as Julian raised his rifle, the silence was broken not by a shot, but by the sudden, terrifying sound of a rock slide from the ridge above. A massive boulder, loosened by the spring thaw, began to tumble down the cliff face, directly toward the trail. The world erupted in chaos. The hunters' horses panicked, rearing and screaming, while the men shouted in blind, terrified confusion. Silas didn't wait. He grabbed Elara, hauling her toward the narrow fissure that led into the high country. They scrambled into the dark, the rock slide masking their movement. But as they ducked into the safety of the earth, Elara felt a searing, sharp pain in her shoulder, a graze from a falling shard of stone. She stifled a scream, biting her lip until it bled, not wanting to give them away. They reached the interior of the cave, the air cooling instantly. Silas pulled her into the deepest, darkest corner, his hands frantic as he checked her for injury, his face pale with a terror she had never seen before. The terror of a man who realized that the thing he had feared most was not losing his own life, but seeing hers end because of him. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, his arms locking around her with a possessiveness that shattered the last of his restraint. "Mort cannot lose you," he rasped, his voice breaking in the dark. The confession, finally, irrevocably spilled into the silence. "Mort cannot." Elara looked up at him, the darkness of the cave mirroring the depth of her own heart. She saw the man, the pain, the love, and the terrifying, beautiful future that lay in wait if they could only survive the mountain. But as she reached up to touch his face, her hand came away sticky with fresh dark blood. It wasn't his, it was hers. And as the darkness swirled around them, she realized with a cold, sinking dread that the rock slide hadn't been an accident. It had been triggered by someone or something, moving on the ridge above them. They weren't just fleeing the Quins. They were being hunted by the mountain itself. The blood on Elara's shoulder was a bright, terrifying crimson against the dull, slate-gray dust of the cave floor. Silas' hands, normally so steady, were shaking. He tore the sleeve of his own flannel shirt to bind the wound, his movements frantic, stripped of their usual deliberate calm. He was just tending a cut. He was frantically trying to staunch a leak in his own heart. "It is only a graze," Elara whispered, her voice tight with the effort of holding back a gasp, as he tightened the makeshift bandage. Silas didn't answer. He pressed his palm against her shoulder, his touch burning with the intensity of his fear. His piercing blue eyes were locked onto hers, searching for any sign of weakening, any flicker of the life he was terrified of losing. "You are pale," he muttered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated in the narrow, cold space. The blood loss, the shock. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her head swam with the sudden, sharp scent of ozone and iron. Outside, the mountain was not silent. The clatter of hooves had stopped, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of men walking on hard stone. A voice, entirely unfamiliar to Elara, echoed into the fissure, deep, resonant, and carrying the heavy, weary weight of authority. "Julian, keep your men back." "Motum the one with the badge here." Silas went rigid. He knew that tone. It was the tone of a man who dealt in warrants, jail cells, and the cold, unyielding finality of the law. He looked toward the fissure entrance, his jaw tightening into a line of granite. "Sheriff Miller," Silas breathed. The name, a curse. Elara felt the temperature in the cave plummet. She gripped Silas's forearm, her fingers digging into the rough flannel. "Who is he?" "The law in the valley," Silas replied, his gaze flickering between the entrance and her injured shoulder. "He is not a man like Julian. He is honest, which makes him far more dangerous." Julian's voice drifted in, slick with feigned sincerity. Sheriff, Mort tell you, the woman is unstable. She stole the family ledger, the deeds, and a significant amount of capital. We were only trying to recover our property when she fled into the mountains with this hermit. He held her captive, likely against her will. The lie was a masterpiece of cold-blooded manipulation. Elara felt a surge of nausea. The Quinns had twisted the truth into a lethal noose, turning her escape into a crime and her protector into a kidnapper. Silas stood, his frame filling the low, cramped space. He drew his knife, the blade catching the dim, gray light from the entrance. He looked at Elara, his eyes dark with a devastating, agonizing resolution. They are going to call for us to come out, he whispered, his voice barely a breath against her skin. If I fight, Mort am an outlaw. If Mort step out with a weapon, they will shoot. If you step out alone, they will hand you directly to Julian under the guise of custody, and he will make sure you never reach the magistrate alive. Then we don't go out, Elara said, her voice fierce. We wait them out. We cannot wait, he said, nodding toward the back of the cave, where the air was growing stale, and the cold of the landslide-blocked vent was sealing them in. The air is thin here, and they have the time. Mort do not. The reality of their situation descended like a shroud. The legal noose was tightening, and the mountain, which had once been their sanctuary, was now becoming a tomb of their own making. Vance, Miller's voice boomed, bouncing off the limestone walls. Mott have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of harboring a fugitive and obstruction of justice, and a warrant for Elara Quinn on charges of grand larceny. Come out with your hands empty. Do not make me come in there. Silas looked at the knife in his hand, then at the entrance, and finally back at Elara. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his touch agonizingly gentle, as if he were trying to memorize the texture of her skin. Mort can save you, he whispered, his voice cracking. But it will cost me everything. Silas. No, she cried, clutching his wrists, terrified by the look of finality in his eyes. They want the property, he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its iron-willed strength. They want the paper. If Mort turn myself in, if Mort force them to take me into town for questioning, Mort can demand a public hearing. Mort can get you to the magistrate. But to do that, Mort have to be the one they handcuff. They will put you in prison, she gasped, her heart splintering. They will lock you away for helping me. It is the only way to break the ledger, he replied, his eyes burning with a dark, sacrificial light. If Moat am the focus, if Moat am the one holding the captive, Julian will have to wait for the law to process me. He cannot touch you while you are in the custody of the sheriff. Moat will not let you sacrifice yourself for me, she insisted, her voice breaking. Moat am not a ledger, Silas. Moat am a woman who loves you. The confession hung in the air, a physical weight that silenced the very walls of the cave. Silas stared at her, the mask of the stoic hermit shattering, his piercing blue eyes swimming with an agony that transcended his physical pain. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching in a jagged, painful rhythm. Moat have spent 10 years waiting for the mountain to take me, he whispered, his voice a jagged, raw confession. And then you fell into my life. You brought the sun to the cold. Elara. You brought me back to the world of the living. He pulled away, his hand lingering on her cheek for one final, agonizing second. He stood, his massive frame towering in the dark, and walked toward the entrance. Vance, Miller shouted again. Silas stopped at the edge of the light. He looked back at her one last time, his gaze holding a depth of longing, protection, rasad, and devastating sorrow. Stay here, he ordered, his voice returning to the iron-willed command of a protector who had made his final choice. When Mott call, you walk out. You walk straight to the sheriff. You do not look back at me. Then do you understand? Silas, she screamed, lunging for him. But he was already stepping out into the blinding white light of the day. She crawled to the entrance, her hand pressed against the cold stone, watching as the silhouette of the giant emerged, his hands raised, his massive form silhouetted against the unforgiving glare of the mountain sun. She watched as the sheriff stepped forward, his pistol drawn, his face a mask of official, detached caution. She watched as Julian emerged from behind him, his face twisted in a sneer of triumphant malice. "I'm turning myself in," Silas' voice boomed, resonant and steady, echoing against the cliffs. "The woman is unarmed. She is injured. Mort am the one you want." The sheriff signaled his men, who swarmed forward, their movements practiced and cold. They grabbed Silas, their hands fumbling for the iron cuffs, their voices harsh and demanding. Elara watched, her heart stopping, as they shackled the man who had been her sanctuary. She watched as Julian stepped toward him, whispering something in his ear, his face close to Silas' rugged, wind-hardened skin. Silas didn't fight. He didn't struggle. He allowed himself to be dragged toward the trail, his back to her, his massive frame a silent, immovable monument to the choice he had made. He didn't look back. He didn't glance at the fisher. He walked into the hands of the law, carrying the weight of his sacrifice, as if it were nothing more than the daily load of timber. Elara scrambled out of the cave, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She stood at the edge of the landslide, the sun blinding, the wind whipping her hair across her eyes. She watched them move down the trail, a line of dark, ink-stained blots against the white, pristine snow. She realized then, with a crushing, absolute clarity, that the legal noose hadn't just caught Silas, it had severed the very lifeline she had used to climb out of her own despair. She stood alone on the high ridge, the silence of the mountain rushing in to fill the space where his presence had been. She had the map, she had the letters, and she had the strength he had restored to her. But as she watched him disappear into the trees, she felt the horrifying realization that the battle for her freedom had only just begun, and she would have to win it without the only man who had ever made her feel safe. What will she do now that the giant who swore to protect her is in chains? The silence that followed their departure was not the peaceful stillness of the mountain. It was a vacuum, a hollow ringing absence that pressed against Elara's eardrums with a crushing, physical weight. She stood on the precipice of the landslide, her hand still raised, her fingers frozen in the air where she had reached for him. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she felt nothing. Not the cold, not the stinging dust, not the ache in her grazed shoulder. She felt only the terrifying finality of the horizon, where he had disappeared. He had walked away without a single backward glance. He had allowed himself to be shackled, led away like a common criminal. And he hadn't even offered a final sign of recognition. The betrayal hit her with the force of a landslide. It was the betrayal of the law or the betrayal of the Quinns. It was the betrayal of their shared sanctuary. She thought of the nights by the fire, the way he had listened to the rhythm of her breathing, the way he had pressed his forehead against hers in the cave. She had believed they were two halves of the same fragile survival. She had believed he saw her, not as a burden, not as a ledger entry, but as a person. But as the trees swallowed the last of his massive, hunched silhouette, the bitter, agonizing thought took root in her mind. Perhaps he did see her clearly. Perhaps he saw a widow who brought nothing but ruin, a liability he had finally grown weary of shielding. Maybe he had seized the first opportunity to unburden himself, using the pretense of protection to cast her off, and return to the solitude he so clearly craved. The anger was a hot, searing coal in her chest, warring with the cold, hollow grief. She looked down at the pack he had left behind, the straps still warm where his massive hands had cinched them. She grabbed the satchel, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and began to descend the mountain. The trek down was a blurred, agonizing marathon. She moved with a reckless, frantic speed, no longer caring about the precariousness of the footing or the danger of the hidden ravines. She followed the trail they had carved through the snow, the path of his capture. Every snapped twig, every disturbed patch of lichen, was a visceral reminder of his presence. She was tracking the man who had abandoned her. She arrived at the trading post just as the sun began to bleed into the western sky, painting the snow in bruised shades of violet and indigo. The main building, a sprawling, weather-beaten structure that served as the valley's only nexus of commerce and law, was ablaze with lantern light. Elara stayed in the shadows of the tree line, shivering in the biting evening air. She watched from behind a dense thicket of spruce. Through the frosted window, she saw him. Silas was sitting at a heavy, scarred oak table in the center of the common room. His hands were bound to the iron rings embedded in the table's edge. Even in his monument, a captive giant, who seemed to occupy more space than the room itself allowed. He sat with his head bowed, his rugged face obscured by the shadow of his brow, his massive shoulders hunched. Standing over him was Julian Quinn, leaning in close, his posture predatory and arrogant. Julian was speaking, gesturing wildly, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. But Elara could not hear the words. She only saw the way Silas remained motionless, a statue carved from granite, refusing to engage, refusing to show even a flicker of pain. The sheriff stood by the door, his face a mask of official detachment, but his posture was stiff, uncomfortable. He was a man who knew the law, but he was also a man who knew the mountain. And there was a palpable hesitation in the way he watched Silas. Elara gripped the strap of her satchel, her knuckles white. She had the letters. She had the map. She had the proof that would shatter Julian's grip on the valley. But as she watched Silas sitting there, broken and shackled, the strategy he had alluded to, the public hearing, the forced legal process, began to take on a terrifying shape. He hadn't been casting her off. The realization hit her with the sudden, sharp clarity of a bell tolling. He hadn't been trying to be rid of her. He had been trying to create a shield that no amount of Quinn money or influence could penetrate. By surrendering, by making himself the focus of the accusation, he had forced the sheriff to bring the matter into the light of the valley, away from the shadows of the high country. He had put himself in the center of the trap to draw the hunters away from her. She felt a sob rise in her throat, a choked, broken sound that she barely managed to swallow. He had loved her enough to let her believe he was abandoning her, because he knew that if she stayed, if she tried to fight for him, she would lose. He had sacrificed his own freedom, his own peace, and the solitude he had guarded for a decade, all to ensure she could walk into that trading post, reveal the truth, and reclaim her life. He hadn't betrayed her. He had given her everything, and he had done it in the only way he knew how, with a stoic, agonizing silence. She took a step forward, her boot crunching on the frozen crust of the snow. A dog tied near the porch began to bark a sharp, piercing alarm. Inside, the common room went still. Julian's head snapped toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the dark. Elara scrambled back, pressing herself into the deep, welcoming shadows of the spruce. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She was so close. She could walk in there. She could pull the letters from her satchel and throw the truth into the center of the room. She could save him. But, as she watched, the sheriff moved toward the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm. He was going to investigate the noise. If she walked in now, If she revealed herself, she would be playing right into their hands. They would seize her, they would take the letters, and they would destroy the only leverage she had to set him free. Silas had given her the chance to fight, but it had to be done on the right terms. She couldn't just barge in. She had to be calculated. She had to be the Mountain. She watched as the sheriff pushed the door open, the golden light of the interior spilling out onto the snow. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes narrowing. But he saw only the vast, indifferent darkness of the forest. Just a stray. Probably, the sheriff muttered, retreating inside and slamming the heavy door shut. Elara let out a long, ragged breath, her entire body trembling. She had been inches from disaster. She had been inches from throwing away the sacrifice that he had made for her. She turned away from the trading post, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't know the law, and she didn't know the courts of the valley. But she knew the heart of the man sitting behind that oak table. She knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her to do the one thing he had been unable to do for himself, to reclaim her dignity, to force the truth into the light, and to prove that she was not property. She walked back toward the dark edge of the forest, the satchel heavy on her shoulder. The silence of the night no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. As she navigated the path back toward the road, she came upon an old, abandoned settler-esque cabin, a structure of rotting logs and sagging roofs that leaned against the slope like a dying man. It was here, in the cold, damp dark, that she would have to wait for the morning that would bring the magistrate, the hearing, and the final reckoning. She entered the cabin, the floorboards groaning under her feet. She sat on the floor, the cold seeping into her bones, and laid out the letters. She read them again, the ink dancing in the dim light of the moon. They were real. The signatures were forged, the dates were falsified, and the trail of greed was plain for anyone with the courage to look. She would go to the magistrate tomorrow. She would go as the widow Quinn, not as a vagrant or a fugitive. She would stand in the center of the town square, and she would tell the truth. But as she lay down to wait for the dawn, a terrifying, gnawing doubt settled in her gut. Silas had committed a crime to harbor her. He had blocked the path, he had been found in possession of a stolen woman, and he had resisted the initial investigation by fleeing. The law was a blunt instrument, and it cared little for the why of a man's heart. She had the truth. Yes. But what if the truth was not enough to save the giant who had broken his own life to piece together hers? What if, in her quest to free him, she only succeeded in sealing his fate? She closed her eyes, the image of his bowed head, his shackled hands, and his silent stoic acceptance burned into her eyelids. She hadn't just lost a protector, she had gained a purpose. And for the first time, she realized that the most dangerous part of her journey was not the mountain, the hunters, or the law. It was the crushing, devastating realization that by the time she succeeded, he might already be lost to her forever. The wind began to rise, whistling through the gaps in the logs. A mournful, haunting sound that seemed to carry the echo of his voice. A voice she might never hear again. The dawn did not break over the valley with the gentle promise of spring. It arrived with a cold, harsh clarity that stripped the world of its soft shadows. Elara stepped out of the rotting cabin, the heavy satchel of letters clutched to her chest as if it were a shield. She had not slept, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. The terror that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a glacial, focused resolve. She walked toward the town, her footsteps steady on the frozen mud, the delicate widow gone, replaced by a woman who had been hardened in the fires of the high country. The trading post and the magistrate's office were already buzzing with the morning activity of the valley. Men moved between the store and the stables, their voices low and sharp. As Elara entered the square, the silence that fell over the men was absolute. They looked at her, this woman who had been whispered about, who had been hunted, who had been lost, and saw not a victim, but a presence. She moved past them, her head held high, ignoring the stares, ignoring the murmurs. She didn't stop until she reached the heavy oak door of the magistrate's chambers. Inside, the room smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the stifling, bureaucratic weight of law. Magistrate Holloway, a man of portly build and suspicious eyes, looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock as he recognized her. Beside him stood Julian Quinn, his hand resting on his cane, his face a portrait of smug, practiced malice. "Elara," Julian began, his voice smooth and oily. "You are making a grave mistake." She didn't let him finish. She crossed the room in 2 strides and dumped the contents of the satchel onto the magistrate's desk. The letters, the forged deeds, the bank notices, they scattered across the blotter. A white flurry of damning evidence. "Read them," she commanded, her voice ringing out, clear and uncompromising. "Read the dates. Compare the signatures. Look at the ledger entries regarding the summer fever." Holloway, confused, picked up the first page. As he read, his heavy brows drew together. He looked at the next, and the next. His ruddy face began to pale. Julian made a move to intervene, his voice rising in protest. But Holloway slammed his hand on the desk, cutting him off. "Quiet, Quinn," the magistrate snapped, his eyes darting across the ink. He looked up at Elara, his expression transformed by a dawning, horrified realization. These are original transfers. If these are authentic, the land never passed to the estate. It remained in trust. "They are authentic," Elara said, her voice steady. "And not have the witnesses from the bank, who notarized the original drafts before they were destroyed." The room seemed to tilt. Julian's smug mask crumbled, his eyes darting toward the door, then back to the magistrate. He was a man who lived by the rule of the ledger, and he had just been checkmated by the very tool he had used to condemn her. "This is a forgery," Julian spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "She says a madwoman." "Enough," Holloway bellowed, standing up. "Sheriff, bring the man in from the holding cell. We have matters to settle." The next hour was a blur of frantic motions, raised voices, and the collapse of a dynasty. When the sheriff brought Silas into the office, his hands still bound by iron shackles, the room went silent. Silas stood, his massive frame dwarfing the magistrate, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face unreadable. He looked exhausted, his rugged features shadowed by the lack of sleep and the weight of the night. He did not look at Elara. He didn't acknowledge her presence, even when the magistrate cleared him of all charges, stating clearly that he had been illegally detained on the basis of fraudulent claims. The sheriff unlocked the shackles, the heavy iron cuffs clattering to the floorboards. Julian Quinn was escorted out by 2 of the magistrate's deputies, his legacy dismantled by the weight of the papers Elara had brought into the light. The threat, the legal noose, the hunt, it was all over. The room emptied slowly. Elara stood by the window, the morning light pouring in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. She waited for Silas to turn to her. She waited for the moment when their eyes would meet, when the silence would be broken by the relief of their victory. But Silas didn't move. He stood near the door, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The sheriff gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of his innocence, and walked out, leaving them alone in the quiet, dusty office. "It is done," Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely disturbed the air. "Yes," Elara replied, taking a step toward him. "It is over." Silas. He didn't step forward. He stepped back. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the paper-strewn desk, then on the door. He seemed to be counting the seconds until he could leave. "You are free, Elara," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all the warmth he had shown her in the cabin, in the cave, in the dark. "You are the heir to the valley. You are a woman of means. You don't need a mountain hermit anymore." The words hit her like a physical blow. The air in the room grew thin, difficult to breathe. She stopped, her hand hovering in the air between them. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Silas looked at her then, and the expression on his face shattered her heart. It was to hatred. It was to rejection. It was a profound, soul-deep unworthiness. He looked at her, as if she were a precious, fragile thing that he had been privileged to hold for a moment, but that now had to be placed back on a pedestal where he could never touch it. Mort was a stopgap. "Elara," he said, his eyes reflecting a dark, unending sorrow. "Mort was a wall between you and the winter. But the winter is gone. You are walking into the spring. Mort don't belong in the light you re-stepping into. You belong ve kepte hat me," she insisted, her voice breaking, and the tears finally spilling over. "Silas, everything I did, everything I fought for, it was so we could be together. It wasn't tea about the land. It was tea about the money." He shook his head. A slow, agonizing movement. "You are the woman who held the truth. Moulton, the man who has nothing to offer but silence and a history of failures." Moat saw the look of those men in the square, the way they respected you. "You are the future of this valley. Moulton just a man who lost his own family to the ice. And Mort would only eventually lose you, too. You are not a failure," she cried, stepping into his space, forcing him to look at her, forcing him to acknowledge the fire she had brought back to his eyes. "You saved me. You brought me back to life when Mott was nothing but a memory. And now you are everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And Mort am. Mott am just a ghost that needs to return to the mountain." He turned away, cuff, his massive frame looking smaller, more bowed than she had ever seen it. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the latch. He paused, his back to her, his shoulders shaking ve kepite hat a single. Violent shudder. "Thank you, Elara," he breathed, "for letting me see, for one last time, what it means to protect something worth saving." He opened the door and stepped out into the bright, blinding street. Elara stood alone in the magistrate's office, the papers of her inheritance scattered across the desk, the freedom she had fought for, weighing heavier than any chain she had ever worn. She didn't run after him. She knew, with a terrifying, absolute clarity, that he would not stop. He was retreating into the high country, back into the shadows of his own self-loathing, convinced that his love was a curse that would only destroy the light she now possessed. She walked to the window, watching his massive, hunched silhouette moving through the crowd, ignored by the townspeople, a stranger in the very place he had saved. He was walking toward the mountain trail, toward the snow, toward the solitude that had been his cage for a decade. She looked at her own hands, then at the scattered papers on the desk. She had everything she had ever been denied. She had safety, she had status, and she had the means to change the world around her. But as she watched him disappear into the tree line, she felt a hollow, aching void where her heart should have been. He thought his sacrifice was the end of the story. He thought that by walking away, he was securing her happiness. He didn't understand the one thing she had tried to tell him, the one thing she hadn't yet been able to make him believe. She wouldn't let him die alone in the dark. She gathered the letters, shoved them back into the satchel, and walked to the door. She knew the mountain better than anyone now. She knew the secret paths, the hidden fissures, and the silent language of the pines. She would follow him, not as a widow in need of protection, but as a woman who knew the true price of sanctuary, and who was prepared to pay it, again and again, until he understood that he was not a failure. He was home. But as she reached the edge of town, the sky darkened, the wind shifting to the north, carrying the unmistakable scent of a late-season blizzard, the kind of storm that buried the world in silence, and which the locals called the widow's weep. Silas was heading straight into the teeth of the gale, and if she didn't reach him before he crossed the timberline, the mountain would finally take him for good. Where is he truly heading? And can she reach him before the storm erases the trail entirely? The blizzard, known to the high country trappers as the widow's weep, descended with a vengeance, turning the world into a chaotic, blinding maelstrom. It was a storm of ice and fury, a relentless, howling wall of white that sought to bury everything in its path. Elara did not cower. She did not shrink. She wrapped her heavy woolen shawl tight against her chest, her jaw set in a line of granite, and she stepped into the gale. Every instinct in her body screamed for the safety of the town, for the warmth of the magistrate's office, but her heart, the heart that had been broken, hollowed out, and then carefully rebuilt by a giant's hands, pointed toward the peaks. She navigated the mountain not as a lost traveler, but as a student of the man she loved. She remembered the way he read the wind, the way he navigated by the subtle shifts in the snow's texture, the way he respected the mountain even while fighting it. She used his trailcraft, his patience, and his unrelenting, stubborn refusal to quit. She was the Widow Quinn, the heir to the valley, but out here, in the freezing dark, she was Elara. The woman who had learned that true belonging wasn't about land or money. It was about the person who made the silence feel like a home. She found the high-altitude outpost hours later, tucked beneath a shelf of granite that offered minimal protection from the screaming wind. The door hung slightly ajar, swinging on a broken hinge. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of cold, dark timber. Silas sat on the floor, his back against the hearth. He had not lit a fire, he had not stoked the embers. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his massive frame slumped, his eyes fixed on the blank, unlit stone of the fireplace. He looked like a statue abandoned by time, a giant who had finally let the weight of the world pull him down. Elara stepped inside, the door groaning as she pushed it shut, instantly silencing the howl of the storm. She didn't speak, she didn't rush to him. She walked to the hearth, her movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. She knelt, struck a match, and touched it to the dry kindling he had meticulously stacked but never lit. The fire caught kept. A small, golden tongue of warmth, licking at the darkness. The crackle of the wood was the only sound in the cabin. Silas did not move. He did not look up. He stared into the nascent flames, his face a mask of profound, hollow despair. "You should not have come," he whispered, his voice as dry and brittle as dead leaves. "The trail is not for you. You are of the valley now." "Mortem where I belong," Elara replied, her voice soft, steady, and entirely unafraid. She moved to his side and knelt, her small, scarred hands resting on the rough fabric of his trousers. "You tried to carry the weight alone, Silas. You tried to build a wall between us to keep me safe. But you didn't realize that by keeping me out, you were the one who was truly lost." He turned his head, his piercing blue eyes searching hers in the firelight. The vulnerability in his expression was a raw, aching wound. "Mort failed you. Mort left you. You did what you thought was necessary to save me," she said, her voice rising with a fierce, tender conviction. "You acted out of love, even when it cost you everything. And that is not a failure, Silas. That is the bravest thing Mort have ever known." She reached out and took his massive, calloused hand, pressing it firmly against her cheek. She let him feel the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her breath, the undeniable, living truth of her presence. "The mountain took your family," she murmured, Her voice, a soothing, rhythmic balm. It took your home. But it did not take your honor. And it did not take your capacity to be loved. Mort am not the ice. Silas. Mort am not the snow. Mort am the woman who chose you. Mort am the woman who waited for you. Silas stared at her, the mask of the stoic hermit finally, irrevocably shattering. He saw the firelight reflecting in her gray eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the absolute, unwavering truth of her devotion. He saw that he hadn't just saved a widow. He had been the catalyst for the birth of a woman who was stronger than the mountain, a woman who had come back for him. His breath hitched. A jagged, broken sound. And for the first time in 10 years, the giant wept. He didn't hide his face. He didn't turn away. He reached out, nope. His massive hands trembling as they cupped her face, pulling her into the space between them. Mort am broken, he confessed, his voice thick with the agony of his long, lonely exile. Then let me help you carry the pieces, she whispered, leaning into his touch, her lips brushing his. Let us build something new. Here, nest, or in the valley, or wherever you wish to stand. But let us stand together. He pulled her into his arms, his hold possessive, desperate, and profoundly gentle. The heat of the fire was nothing compared to the warmth of his embrace. It was an embrace of earned redemption, of two wreckage-strewn souls finding anchor in the storm. In the quiet, golden light of the cabin, the giant mountain man and the beautiful widow realized that they hadn't just survived the winter. They had survived their own ghosts. They were finally truly home. The wind outside continued to scream, but the cabin remained a sanctuary, a small, glowing beacon of life against the vast, indifferent expanse of the mountain. In the days that followed, the storm broke, leaving the world bathed in the pristine, blinding light of late winter. They didn't return to the valley immediately. They stayed, rebuilding the high outpost, tending to the hearth, and learning the language of a life shared. The trauma of the past, the debt, the greed, the cold, and the fear did not vanish, but it ceased to define them. They carried the memory of their hardships not as a burden, but as the foundation of their bond. Silas learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but the ultimate strength, and Elara learned that her resilience was not a shield to keep the world out, but a vessel to invite love in. They created a life that was both theirs and theirs alone. A life built on the simple, profound acts of survival, chopping wood, tending the fire, sharing the warmth of a morning meal, and watching the sun set over the jagged, beautiful peaks they had once feared. They were two people who had been forged in the crucible of their own histories, emerging from the dark not as they had been, but as something new, something deeper, something unbreakable. And as the spring finally arrived, bringing the green of the pines and the soft, waking murmur of the valley, they descended the mountain together. They didn't return to the valley as a giant and a widow, but as a man and a woman, side by side, their hands clasped, their steps synchronized. The valley awaited, with its ledgers and its judgments, but they were no longer governed by the expectations of the world. They were governed by the truth they had found in the silence of the high country. They had found that home was not a place, nor was it a promise. Home was the person who stayed when the storm was at its fiercest. Home was the giant who lowered his shield and the widow who stood tall. Home was the earned, quiet peace of knowing that no matter what the mountain brought, they would never face it alone again. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are the products of the author. Normally Mot can help with things like this, but Mot don't seem to have access to that content. You can try again or ask me for something else.